Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
So for context, I grew up in the suburbs, and outside of the occasional play park or sports field, there was nothing to do. Lee and my neighbors used to play knock and run, or its other name, ding dong ditch. For context, I have a sister who is a year younger than me, and my neighbor James was the same age as me. His older sister was 14 at the time, and she also played with us from time to time, although I think she just wanted to hang out with my sister, whom she thought was cute. I was admittedly the biggest coward in the group, and to this day, my flight instinct is significantly stronger than my fight instinct, so I would never ring the doorbell as I would always find a way to wiggle out of it. I always found watching it more entertaining than doing it. On this particular afternoon, my cousins came over. One of my cousins was my age, the other was a few years younger than me and couldn't play with us, and the other was a year older than me, but everyone treated him like he was an adult, even though he was only 11, or at least that's how I perceived it. Let's call this cousin Daniel, as he is somewhat important to the story. My cousins came over, and we were banished outside to play, and we all decided that knock and run was a good idea. We usually just played around our immediate street, never venturing further than the next street over out of fear of getting lost in the coppice and pasted suburban streets. We made our way up the street to the play park on top of the hill. It sat where a house could have been, and someone could cut across it onto the next road. As we sat on the play equipment, we decided that a vote should decide who knocked first, and of course I was picked. I remember getting myself out of it and getting my older cousin to take my place. I am thankful that he was and is as proud as he is. It helped me get out of a lot of situations. We decided that our first target would be the fanciest looking house in the area, a white marble house with a fountain in the front yard and a curved driveway. I remember sitting next to a car. I was small enough to look under it from the curb, and I had a clear view of my cousin sneaking up to the door and ringing the doorbell 3 times in order to get the attention of whoever was inside, and he bolted down the pathway towards the street to hide behind the cars. But before he got to the fence, an older man in a black leather apron with what I assumed was paint came sprinting after him. I immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't the usual response to a knock and run. Sure, we have encountered some angry people before, but this was something very different. He practically flew down the walkway towards Daniel and threw his hand out to grab him. This didn't feel like anything someone his age could do, and it scared me. I think I might have been the only one with a clear view of what was going on, which meant that I was the first to see what was happening. It wasn't until the man was practically on top of Daniel that he noticed that he was being chased, and the scream that he made when he realized this will always stick with me. As I said at the start of this, Daniel was and still is a very proud person who will always try to prove himself, so hearing this scream of pure terror struck at my core. Everyone was clued in at this point as to what was happening. Daniel didn't open the waist-high gate at the end of the path, he just jumped it, which I think ultimately saved him from getting hurt as the old man had to take a second to open it. Daniel was sprinting down the street as fast as I had ever seen him. "Stop, you little brat," the man shouted with a deep, angry voice, which did actually stop Daniel in his tracks. They were both standing in the middle of the road at this point, reminding me of an old western movie when 2 cowboys would be standing at either end of the main road. The man marched straight up into Daniel's face, and I could finally get a good look at him. His skin resembled rough leather, and the few strands of hair on his head had long since grayed. He was clean shaven, and he was wearing white pants, a white button-up, and a black leather apron that had what I rationalized as red paint on it. After he was maybe half a foot from Daniel, he started to berate him, and I could only make out the words "sick people" in there. Everything about this man threw me off, and I could see my neighbor and my other cousin, who was hiding in the bushes, felt the same. My neighbor's older sister, whom I will call Tay, screamed out at him from the other side of the road, which gave Daniel the opportunity to run as fast as he could away from the man. We all ran at that point. I don't think I or anyone else knew where we were running off to, but I found myself in the car park of the shopping center across the road from me. I waited there for maybe 30 minutes, just watching cars come in and out, feeling safer with the large group of people. I had no idea at the time if he chased one of us, but I knew that I was safe. I made my way back to my house and found that I was the last one to return. My cousin Daniel ran straight home, and Tay followed him. My other cousin and neighbor ran around the suburbs for a bit before deciding to go home. My mom was missing when I got home, and I realized that she had been told what happened. My mother is someone who isn't afraid of protecting her own, and she is one of the strongest people I know, so I felt pretty safe that she was aware and was off telling him to screw off. But when she got back, she seemed off. She didn't want to talk about it or anything, and any color from her face had completely drained. We slept at my neighbor's house that night because my mom wanted to talk to my dad about something serious, and I think we all knew what it was about. Nothing happened for a while after that, not for a while, but my mom was a lot more protective of what we did outside. We were no longer allowed to play knock and run or go up the road without a parent. It really bugged my sister, who loved to play outside, but I don't think she fully understood what happened. I have a lot more stories about this guy, and I probably will write more because this has helped me get a better grip on everything that happened throughout that year. But I hope you enjoy the very first event in one of the worst periods of my life. Part 2. Okay, so before I get into the next few events, I think that it is important to address some things that I've read in the last post. I know that we were the ones who originally disturbed him, but I thought it was important to dedicate a post to that event as it kind of kicked off a lot of stuff. I will probably update this post with a few more stories just to get it all out there, but I just wanted to say that I fully understand me and everyone else's part to play in part 1, but I believe that the issue really began after that, which is what I'll show you today. First things first, I promised a few of you that I would ask my mom what the old man had told her last night at dinner, and I did manage to do so. She was surprised that I remembered what happened and tried to sweep it under the rug, but I kept pressing her for answers. I'm not proud of pressuring my mother into talking to me about something like this, but curiosity got the better of me. I know that that isn't an excuse, but I feel it somewhat justifies my actions, as a lot of you wanted to know as well. After I pressed her for more answers, she grabbed my arm and led me to my room before placing me on my bed. She sat next to me and told me not to repeat anything of what I said to my sister, my cousins, or anyone else who was involved with this man throughout that year. She finally opened up about how she was sitting at home watching television when she heard a loud knock on the front door. It was my cousin Daniel and my neighbor Tay, who looked terrified and exhausted. After letting them in and grilling them for answers, my mom was rightfully pissed that someone had spoken to them in such a way, and so she got up to go and confront the man, and on her way out, my other cousin and neighbor arrived, whom she also sent inside. She was concerned about where I was, but Daniel made it clear that I ran in the opposite direction of the man and that he would go out looking for me, which it turned out he didn't. My mom made her way up to the play park and saw the man pacing back and forth up and down his driveway. He didn't seem angry or upset. He apparently didn't seem like anything besides someone marching back and forth, which took my mother's mood from enraged to confused. She walked up to the front gate and let herself in, which made the man stop almost immediately and stare at her. I am surprised that she didn't turn back and go home at that point, because that's what I imagine anyone would have done. But as I said in part 1, I am a coward. The man marched up to my mom and started to berate with her about trespassing on his property, which she met by berating with him about terrifying some kids. This apparently went on for a couple minutes before he said something that terrified her. My mom didn't say exactly what he said because she said that she was trying to forget it, but he said something along the lines of, "I will show both of you what it feels like to have somebody on your property when you don't want them there, and then I'll shut those kids up forever." He tried to grab her at that point, but she quickly moved away and left his yard, swiftly walking back home. This really affected my mom, but that was the answer I got from her. I gave her a hug and apologized for pressing her to tell me, and we got back to dinner shortly after. It had been about a month, maybe a month and a half, since the first initial incident with the man. We hadn't seen him since, and I was forgetting about it until I went to the shops one day. For context, my parents had started to let me go to the shops by myself to grab little things for them. I was young at the time, and the shops were across the road from me, so getting there wasn't an issue. One day, my dad asked me to go and grab a loaf of bread for him. He gave me two $2 coins and sent me on my way to the shops. I was getting used to doing this on my own and enjoying my independence. I grabbed the bread, which was on the far side of the large supermarket, and made my way towards the registers. I stopped by the toy aisle and took a look at all of the low-quality, mass-produced action figures that I desperately wanted. This was part of my routine. Even now, if I wanted something but didn't have money to get it, I would just look at it. But on this occasion, I wish I had just continued to the registers. I felt two hands push me to the ground from my left. I was shocked for a moment, as I didn't fully know what had just happened. The sticky and dusty floor beneath me hurt. It took me a second to look at my attacker, and when I did, I immediately knew that this was very wrong. It was the old man from up the road. He had found me in the place that I had hid from him just a month prior. He started to shout at me, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. I don't know if it was the adrenaline ringing in my ears or his rage just taking over, but the tone in which he was shouting shook me. I tried to get up to run, and when I planted my foot on the ground to get up, he kicked it out from below me, which made me fall back on the ground. Thank God a staff member arrived at this point. They must have heard us shouting from across the store and come to check on what was happening. I didn't get a good look at the staff member, but I am thankful for them. As I got up to run with the loaf of bread in my hand, I could hear the man reacting to me getting away, and it took everything in me not to look behind me to look at him. But I knew that he was furious. I ran straight out of the store with the bread without realizing it and almost threw up from all of the emotions. I told my parents when I got home, and they both made it clear that I wouldn't be going on any shopping trips by myself from here on out. They didn't think about how me and my sister walked together to school, which in hindsight should have been something that they thought of. The trip to my school wasn't a long one, it was just over a kilometer long, or just over half a mile, but the trip was still tough on small legs. There were quite a few hills, which added time to our trip there, and the path went along a creek with nothing around it. It was nice and isolated, which helped relax my mind after school. Not long after the supermarket incident, me and my sister were walking home from school and just made our way to the beginning of the path along the creek when we saw a van that had been parked there for what I assumed had been a while. I thought it was empty, but as you could probably guess, it wasn't. We turned to enter the creek when the van door opened, and we heard someone shouting out to us, "Hey, do you guys want to drive home?" It was the man. My sister, who was always trusting of others, started to walk towards the truck, but I quickly held her back. "What's wrong?" the man said in a cheerful tone. This was very different from the unintelligible screaming from just the week before, and I obviously wanted nothing to do with this man. I quickly started to lead my sister towards the creek, and the man quickly scooted over towards the door. "Wait up, I will walk you home." I should have run up the hill towards the school, but instead I started to sprint down the creek. Looking back at this, I feel stupid. Daniel was faster than me, and the man had been able to catch up to them in seconds, but for some reason he didn't leave his truck. All I heard was another unintelligible scream and his truck driving away. My sister was beyond pissed that we didn't get a ride home and that we had to walk, but I didn't care. She and I were safe, and so we continued walking along the path. Thinking back to it, the path was beautiful and connected on either side to small, quiet streets, the perfect in-between of isolation. Sadly, my young mind didn't realize that the creek opened to two quiet streets, and so when I saw that same silvered van on the street at the end of the path, I froze. What could I have done? I felt powerless and had to take care of my sister, who was only now figuring out that this man may not have good intentions. I decided that the best course of action was to cross the creek and walk through the bushes to the other side. This was a beyond dangerous idea as there were slippery rocks, animals, and running water. This very easily could have injured or killed us, but somehow we managed. We climbed over logs of wood and under tree branches, through prickly bushes, and through large plants. But we managed to do it and crossed over to another road that we followed towards the main road, which took us home. Obviously, those two vans could have been different, but at the time I was certain they were the same, and even now I am not 100% sure if they were different. I only found out about this later, but my parents got the police involved at this point. But based on the fact that more stuff happened, I am going to say that they probably didn't do much. There were a few other things that happened throughout this time, like mail being stolen, our bins being pushed over, and the front door knocking at the early hours of the morning that we knew was him, although we had no real proof. There is one last thing that I will bring up before I end part 2. For context, my dad used to have campouts with me and my sister. We would sleep out on the couch, and my dad would sleep on a mattress on the floor. The couches we would sleep on were right next to the front door in the living room. We would watch movies with pizza or some other type of takeaway. It was really fun, and I remember those nights, but one particular night will stick with me. Everyone else went to sleep, and Naruto was on. I hadn't watched or read Naruto at that point, but I recognized the characters. I was sitting directly next to the large window that looked out onto the driveway. I was just enjoying doing nothing when I saw some movement out on the driveway, and so I looked out, and there he was, walking up to our front door, wearing his white pants and white button-up shirt. He was staring directly at our front door with such focus that it felt like nothing would break it, but something did, and it was me. He looked at me, and I could see in his eyes that it was funny to him. He simply held his hand up, waved at me, and then placed one finger on his mouth as if he were telling me to shush, and then he jogged away. I surprisingly fell asleep not long later. Now looking back and remembering what my mom had told me, I think I know what he was trying to do. Part 3, it was summer, and the local council decided to have a fair. The local council hired a few clowns, some face painting stations, food trucks, and bouncy castles at the local football field. Of course, me and my sister were beyond excited to go. For a young child, this was the hottest ticket in town, and my parents were happy to take us as it was just down the road and free. I remember the field being beyond busy, the crowd was difficult to walk in and even harder to see through, but we managed to find ourselves right next to a giant blow-up bouncy slide. As it was summer, the actual balloon of the slide burned to the touch, and the sun made me feel like I was slowly melting. Regardless of this, I must have spent at least 40 minutes going up and down that slide. I was having too much fun and didn't notice that both my parents and sister had gone missing in the giant crowd of people. I got down from the slide, put my shoes and socks back on, and started to make my way through the crowd. I didn't actually know where I was going, and I remember feeling incredibly anxious as I waddled around the fair. It wasn't until I felt a hand on my shoulder shoulder and then on my forearm that I felt a little safer. It was my dad. I thought he had found me. I couldn't actually tell whose arm it was, as the angle at which he was holding my arm made it difficult to look at in a crowd. The whole day was overly stimulating, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I should have known from how hard the hand was gripping me or the fact that it was leading me to the parking lot that something was wrong. I only really felt terror when I saw my parents running towards me, running faster than I had ever seen them run. Adrenaline immediately coursed through my veins, and I pivoted my body around and immediately saw the leathery hand on my arm and white pants. The link was connected in my mind as to who this was. My mother's scream was the first thing I heard, and the angry or annoyed grunt of the old man followed it. He started to jog with me towards his truck, but I had started to fight back against his grip. He may have been old, but he was stronger than any elderly person should be, and he was faster too. Everything about this man was wrong, and it may have been my young mind making it all up, but I still believed that something was very weird about him. No elderly person should be like this. At this point, I was only a couple feet away from his car, and as he opened the door, I felt two hands on my right arm that pulled me hard against the man's grip. The man's grip held on before my dad came out from behind me and slammed the old man's head into his car, which loosened his grip on me. At this point, my mother grabbed me and ran, and we went straight home. Apparently, they didn't notice me slip away on the bouncy slide, and they ran into some family friends who offered to take care of my sister while they searched for me. I don't know what type of person it takes to do something like that in such a populated area, but this man was not normal, not in the slightest. My dad returned later that night. He looked really roughed up and drained of all energy. From what I had gathered over the years, they got into a pretty brutal fight that ended with the police breaking it up. My dad didn't get into that much trouble considering that he had called the police on the man before, but they still took him to the station to give a statement. When he sat down on the couch, he looked exhausted, bruises forming all over and a cut on his lip and upper eyebrow still leaking blood. But he had a smile on his face, and I could hear him telling my mom that it was over. They were both hopeful, and so was I. A couple weeks later, my cousins came back over, and Daniel wanted to know everything. He felt like he was the main victim and deserved to know everything because he was the one that the man shouted at and the one that the man wanted to get the most. I don't disagree that the man would probably try to hurt him on sight, but it felt weird to me, almost like he was trying to take credit for something that to him sounded like a creepy story, but to my family was real. Anyway, we decided to go out for a bit. My parents trusted us because we were with my older cousin. We went up to the usual play park, which was across the street from the man's currently vacant house. Daniel was telling us all about how he swore that he saw him near his house. Keep in mind that he lives almost 3 hours away. I am not saying that he is a liar, but I am saying that he wanted to be part of this. Anyway, we were playing hide and seek. Tay, our neighbor, was seeking, and she had only just started to count down from 60. I always tagged along with Daniel because he always found the best spots. We ran across the road towards the man's house, and Daniel jumped the fence, which I immediately stopped at. "Come on," he said from the other side of the waist-high fence. "No one will find us." The house felt like a void that we would get sucked into, and I had up until this point refused to even be near it. But for some reason I agreed. I joined him in the man's yard, and to my shock, Daniel wanted to go deeper into his home, not just his yard. I made it clear that this was a very bad idea. Even if he was in custody, jail, or whatever, we would be breaking into someone's home. Daniel didn't seem scared by it, though I think the whole idea of being in the man's house seemed too attractive to him. We went around the side fence into his backyard. It was overgrown, almost like no one had been living there for years. I made my way towards his back window and looked inside. From what I could make out, he was a hardcore minimalist, only having a television, chair, fireplace, and shelf that housed some photos of a much younger man and some medals. He was a veteran. It changes nothing to me, but it explains his above average speed and strength, especially for his age. The sound of a door sliding open almost made me yell in fear. Daniel had found an unlocked sliding door and wanted to venture inward. I ran around to find him, but he was already inside before I could stop him. At this point, I was also curious to find out more, but I understood the risk of this all. It didn't matter if I understood it because I went in with him. The rest of the house reflected the living room. The kitchen had a fridge and a stove, and the dining room only had a small table with one wooden chair. There was no decoration on the walls or signs of life besides these sad reminders of how lonely the man had been. As I said, this changes nothing for me. I hate this man more than anyone can know. We made our way upstairs and found 2 completely empty rooms in one bedroom, a single bed with a bedside table filled with different types of weapons, a hatchet, a knife, and a knuckle duster. I had never seen a knuckle duster before, and I successfully fought the urge to take it and put it on. This was something that Daniel failed to do, as he almost immediately grabbed it, which I almost hit him for. We continued searching the house, and Daniel had the idea that he must have something weird in his wardrobe, and when we opened it, he gave a disappointed sigh as there was nothing inside except a few white button-ups and white pants. This especially creeped me out as he never wore anything else. We made our way back down the stairs and into the living room, and to our surprise, we missed the table that sat next to the couch. It was just out of view and only had one drawer. Daniel opened it and struggled to get it out fast, but when he did, we found something profoundly strange. It was a single photo. Neither of us could make out what it was, but we knew that it looked familiar. Daniel sat down in the chairboard, and it was only then that we heard Tay scream out that she had given up. Daniel shot up and sprinted back out to the backyard. We had both completely forgotten about her, but as I put the photo back into the drawer, something stood out to me about the photo. The fence was navy blue. This was something unusual in my area, and I knew of only one navy blue fence in the suburb, our side door entrance fence. This realization made the photo seem so much clearer. The white pebbles on the ground leading to the backyard, the cream color of the garage next to it, and the green bush at the end of the path. This was my home. He had a photo of my home. I quickly met back up with Daniel and Tay, and we went back home. I should have told my parents, but I was scared that I would be in trouble if they found out that we were in his home. I understand why we would be, but I still didn't want to live up to it. About a month after that, we were having another camp out with me, my dad, and my sister. Both my sister and my dad had fallen asleep with the television still on, illuminating the room. It was one of those weird situations where you were both really comfortable and really uncomfortable. That was my situation, and on most nights I love this feeling, but that feeling will always be tied to this night. I was drifting off to sleep as well, but I heard the sliding back door open slowly. I peered up above the couch and saw a silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. I froze with fear and started to cry. My dad woke up at this point. I am not entirely sure how. Maybe it was a parental instinct, but he knew almost immediately that something was wrong. He got off the bed and crouched towards the dining room, which is where the back door was. The other man had begun to walk slowly through the house at this point, murmuring to himself. To my horror, I recognized the pants, the bright white pants. So many questions went through my mind, the most prevalent one being how he was in custody. But none of that mattered because there he was, standing in my dining room, holding something. My dad charged him from around the corner and tackled him into the wall. The old man punched him in the arm, and my dad immediately dropped that arm. It was the knuckle dusters that Daniel was wearing. It was at this point that the lights turned on. I don't know if it was my dad or the man, but they came on, and my dad made a noise of pure horror. Both men were fully healed from their last fight, but my dad took a real beating. I had always expected that the old man had had his butt kicked, but now I am not so sure. My dad was standing in the doorway to the living room, shielding us with his body. My sister was awake and crying at this time, as was I, and my mom also ran down the stairs and immediately saw everything that was going on. The man had lunged at my dad with a thing in his hand that I could see was a hatchet. My dad threw himself to the side, and his other arm got grazed by the hatchet, drawing blood. My mom at this point leapt towards the old man and pushed him into the kitchen bench, which made him scream, but he was up almost as fast as he was down. He slashed at my mom and missed her, and my dad ran to the other room and started to call the police. My mom was dodging his slashes while also throwing things at him. Once she got to the knife block, she armed herself with 2 knives and threw one of them, and the handle hit him in the face, knocking him back. My mom took the opportunity and drove the knife into his shoulder, which made him scream again. He fell to the ground and didn't try to get up until the police arrived. After this happened, we moved not too far away, maybe just half an hour away. Even though we live so close to that place, we have never returned. As much as I have been tempted to go back and relive some stuff, for the time being, I am pretty comfortable staying here. Apparently, he paid bail and was staying in the hospital for a while before staying at somebody else's house. I know that he made his way back to his house before making his way to my home. It creeps me out to think that I could have been in his home at the same time as him. Well, anyway, it's been 10 years, and it's been something that's been on my mind for a while. I want to thank you all for hearing my story. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. I grew up in a small town. The total population was maybe 2,000. Everyone knew everyone else, or at least knew your family members. It was a safe town with mostly middle-class working families. Nothing major ever happened and the crime rates were low. I grew up feeling safe and secure. To note, I grew up in the 90s. One summer day, my good friend Ginny and I were out for a bike ride. We were 11 years old. We were allowed to bike anywhere we wanted, as long as we didn't leave our town and wore our helmets. There was a new road being constructed in between the 2 main neighborhoods. The new road was to provide a shorter way of accessing the main road to get to the next town. At the time, the road was still under construction but was nearly complete. All that was left was paving and painting. Ginny and I decided to bike down the gravel road. Ginny and I were about halfway down the road. The road was about a kilometer long. At the halfway point, we noticed a man walking. He was early 30s and very handsome. I didn't recognize him and Ginny didn't either. As we got closer, he broke out in a big smile and said hello. We said hello back as he didn't seem threatening or scary. He asked us if we were having a good summer and we said yes. He told Ginny and I he was a photographer from a nearby city and was in town to scout out models for his new postcard company. He said Ginny and I had beautiful features. He said everything in a very flattery way that made us feel special. He said we could be models. He asked if he could take our pictures. He said we had the look he wanted and the scenery right now is perfect to promote the town. He said he knows he will sell tons of postcards and we could all make money. Ginny and I eagerly agreed. He got us to stand with our hands on our hips and smile big. He took a disposable camera out of his back pocket and began snapping photos. He took about 10 photos in total from many angles. I remember feeling a little uneasy and said we should probably go because we needed to be home soon. He said he would get in touch with our principal on the first day of school to give us some money from the postcard sales. We foolishly confirmed we went to the local elementary school, though it was the only elementary school in town so it wouldn't be hard to figure out. Neither Ginny or I remember to this day giving him our names. This is an important detail for later. Ginny and I talked about becoming famous on the way home. I told Ginny that I wondered why he didn't have a professional camera. She said she wondered that too, but we agreed cameras are expensive so maybe he didn't have a nice one with him in case it rained. That evening at supper, I told my parents about my potential newfound fame. They were horrified and got on the phone with Ginny's parents. The two sets of parents called police and gave statements. Police sort of downplayed it and said it was unusual but nothing criminal had happened. My parents had a long talk to me about safety, as did Ginny's parents with her. The following spring, Ginny and I were hanging out together, this time a little older and a little wiser and a lot more cautious. We were walking along a quiet side street, just talking about music and television shows. A minivan approached us and slowed down. A friendly looking woman asked us if we knew where Smith's Road was. We told her she just needed to drive straight for less than a minute and it's the first right hand turn. She said she was having difficulty finding it and would we mind hopping in and showing her. I instantly said no. Ginny also declined. Then the woman said it was okay because she knows who we are. She called us both by first name and said she saw us on a postcard. By now, we were both freaked out. We were on a stretch of the road that had no houses. The nearest one was about 100 meters away, and it wasn't common for people to have cell phones back then, so neither Ginny or I had one. The woman continued to ask us to get in her minivan. Ginny, who was normally super chatty, was staring into the vehicle intensely. Her body language was stiff and I could tell she was scared. Suddenly, and seemingly out of nowhere, Ginny screamed run. I didn't know what was happening, but I ran and followed Ginny. We ran off the road and through a field and into a yard another street over. I recognized the yard and house as belonging to a school teacher. We pounded on her door and she answered. We told her what happened, and then Ginny said something I will never forget. She said she saw the photographer man from last summer crouching down into the very back row of seats. She said she knew something bad was going to happen. Police and our parents were called. We gave statements and a vehicle description as well as descriptions of the man and woman. Unfortunately, the police were never able to locate them. Ginny and I never saw them again. We had some serious trust issues with strangers after those encounters. Always make sure to teach your children that strangers are not safe, no matter how nice they are. My situation could have had a much more unfortunate outcome if things had gone even slightly differently. I was about 5 or 6. I went to my local kindergarten and I was as carefree as a child can be, the greatest of my worries being if my mom forgets to pick me up from school. She never does, and every day we walked from school to home and vice versa since it was a good walking distance. We lived in a compound that's kind of secluded and mostly inhabited by old people or boarding students who went to the university near it. This morning started out like any other. My mom picks me up and we're walking along the small path in our compound along with 4 other people, 3 high schoolers, 2 of which were walking together, and a female college student. She was holding a handkerchief over her head because of the heat. The sun was high up and glaring in the middle of the day that you wouldn't expect anything to happen. But it did. We were quite far back from this group when I turn around and see a man join us. He's clearly not from there. He had a bright neon green bag in front of him which was slightly opened, one of his hands inside it. His clothes were kinda dusty, but most of all, he was glaring at us. It was just us 5 walking in this quiet compound, and my little self didn't think much of it up until my mom squeezed my hand hand and started speed walking. At first I was confused, but I knew the only thing that could trigger this was that there was danger behind us, and it came in the form of the stranger that was following us closely behind. I kept looking back discreetly and still he kept staring at all of us, getting closer and closer. I looked up at my mom trying to ask what was going on, but her low murmurs didn't really translate well for me, except my ears picking up on the word knife. That's when I felt my stomach drop. As a child, you only ever watch of scary situations happening on television, never really thinking you'd be in any real danger, but I was now in one, and my stupid little legs weren't fast enough. Factor in my mom's older age, she was around 50. Compared to our other companions, we were the easy target. We were pretty much at the back, but our house was near and I focused on that because if I thought about the threat behind us, my legs would feel like jelly and I'd end up slowing down. Still, I couldn't resist looking back. He just kept getting closer and closer, shortening the distance between us. I remember thinking about how I wanted to scream for help, desperately looking at these houses that seemed empty, wanting to go inside, but my mom's firm grip kept me going. Anyways, we lived here too. I never really knew if the others were aware of it, not much until later. One of the high schoolers left to a house over the basketball court, and further down the path, the pair veered off to a different trail that led to the main highway, so it was just us and the female college student. At this point, the man was also speed walking and catching up, but our apartment was merely a few steps away, and my mom and I dashed towards it, up the stairs and into the comfort of our own home. The man gave us one last glare, but he continued to walk. My heart was pounding against my chest. My mom had left me to lock the door while she stared out the window. She kept repeating, "He has a knife." I saw it. He's holding a knife. I run towards the window and catch a glimpse of the girl, still clutching that handkerchief above her head, looking behind her in fear and alarm as the man continued to follow her. His bright, neon bag in front of him, now wide open, his hand still inside as he kept getting closer and closer. I don't really know what happened after, only of my mom's recollection of the events. She had noticed the man suddenly come up behind us too, and her suspicions were raised when he didn't try to walk past us like the others but maintained a close distance between us. And then she saw the knife, hidden in his bag, holding onto it as he stared at us. I hope that girl is okay, and that man was detained or something, but it's been years now and I don't really know where to start. Don't really know if I'd like to. Sometimes I wonder what that girl must have been feeling and if she had escaped. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. Hi, this only happened a few hours ago, so I'm shaken, but it's too early in the morning to phone and wake up friends, and I needed to talk to someone and get this out. I'm so creeped out and concerned, so I thought of coming here. Brief setting and context: I'm a woman in my 30s, caring for my elderly parents, so staying in a downstairs room in my childhood home at the moment. The window faces the main street, which is an average residential street in a fairly quiet area. The bed faces the window. I often leave the window open at night since I need it to be cool to sleep, and I haven't really worried about it since there's a cabinet with an aquarium in front of the window area, not blocking the window from view, and I can reach to open and close it, but it would make it difficult for someone to climb in. My dog, Sable, also always sleeps in the room with me. While she's a sweet-natured, medium-sized dog who doesn't look the least bit threatening, she's a fantastic guard dog in that she's always alert to any noises, and will stand her ground and bark and growl if she senses a threat, so I've never really worried about the open window. After tonight, I won't be able to do it again. It started at maybe 3:30 or 4 in the morning sometime. I was awake. Since I care for my parents, I often have disrupted sleep patterns and I'm awake at odd hours. I was reading a book and heard Sable growl, low and deep. Then she jumped off the bed and began pacing a bit, looking up at the window before jumping up at the cabinet by the window, barking. I shouted, "Hey, we're calling the police, dog will bite," just in case there was someone there, and went to look out of the curtains to the side. I didn't see anything. I pulled the curtains closed again and made sure to pull the right curtain over, then drew the left side curtain, the one that covers the open part of the window, all the way over, covering the right side curtain too, tucking it down so any wind wouldn't be able to move it. I wasn't really alarmed then. It's a fairly quiet residential street, but there are foxes around that we sometimes hear, and occasionally someone passing by or the neighbor's gate next door will make Sable growl or bark, but she doesn't usually react the way she did this time. She'll usually growl, but stay on the bed, and her reaction was much stronger than normal. I thought that even if it was someone scoping out the open window to potentially burgle, they'd see now that the room was occupied by a person and dog. and would go find an easier target, but mainly I guessed it was just a random noise she'd heard outside. I was wrong. It was a good half hour or more later, after I'd relaxed and thought I might doze off soon, that I heard her growl again. A really serious, deep and low growl, and I listened again, thinking it might be foxes or something, but I heard what sounded like deep, horror movie breathing noises, like the heavy breathing sounds a pervert makes down the phone to his stalking victim in a film. I sat up, looked up at the window, and my heart stopped. The curtain had been pulled back and lifted at the bottom like someone peeking under it, and I could still hear the heavy breathing. I shouted hey again and moved from the bed to the side of the window so I could see past the curtain, and saw the figure of a man move away from the window to the right, towards the front door and the exit of the front garden. Too dark to make out features or clothing, it was just a dark male figure. Shaking, I immediately thought that since I knew he'd moved away and wasn't at or under the window, I reached it, pulled it shut, grabbed my phone, and called the emergency services. One thing that creeps me out, in hindsight, is that it would have taken a few seconds for me to move from the bed to the side of the window, and that was after I'd shouted and he knew he'd been seen, but he must have stayed there even knowing I'd seen him, until I moved the curtain and could see out. Then he moved away. The heavy breathing also had to be deliberate. It was so loud, like someone trying to frighten me. While on the phone with police, I went around the ground floor of the house turning lights on, making sure the rest of the house was still secure, and it was. Very careful to lock doors and all the other windows at night, and everything looked undisturbed. 2 patrol officers came shortly before 5 in the morning and took the report. They suggested asking the neighbors if they have camera footage and to let them know of a potential prowler in the area tomorrow. And they went to drive around the area, saying that they'd be wanting to know what someone was doing wandering around at 5 in the morning, the time the police arrived anyway. Since the dark meant I only saw the shape of a person, no real description, I doubt they can do much. I couldn't even be 100% certain it was a man, but the breathing and the figure I saw instantly made me think male. The outline of his head looked smooth, so either bald or wearing a tight cap, and height would have been average, 5'8" to 5'10". I'm still shaken, but feeling angry and violated, and wishing we had a camera system now. We'll be looking into that. I never thought anything like that would happen. Don't have any enemies, no recent exes, no one I know of harboring any grudges, since I'm caring for my folks full time now. I'm not out socializing or making any enemies, nor are my elderly and disabled parents. I'm at the wrong side of 35 and living in jeans or joggers and shirts, no makeup or fussing with hair most of the time, so not a likely target for a peeping Tom pervert. If it wasn't for the fact that it was my dog who alerted me to something both times, I'd wonder whether I was half asleep and dreamed it. That I'd imagined it, I have to think it was someone who was looking to burgle a house, but for the fact that they came back so much later, maybe someone on drugs, or having a mental health episode, or, and this one bothers me most, someone who wanted to scare me. But why? Who? They know where we live. Are they going to come back? New fears keep popping into my mind. Like most nights, I'm up at some point late at night or in the very early hours, and will let the dog outside into the back garden for a quick pee, and I'm suddenly aware of how easy it would be attack and gain entry then. There's a passage around the side of the house to go from the front to the back garden with only a small side gate, meant to keep the dog confined, not designed to keep others out. It would be easy for someone to access then hide against the back of the house, completely hidden from view. They were bold enough to come back a second time, even knowing a person and a dog were in the room. Perhaps hoping I would have fallen asleep by then, they seemed to be trying to deliberately scare me when they returned the second time, doing that deep breathing noise, and stayed by the window even after I'd shouted. In those few seconds it would have taken from me shouting out, until I reached the window and could move the curtains and see out. They could have moved and been long out of sight, but they'd stayed there until there was a chance I could see them, only then moving away. The breathing noises and then the coldness that ran through me when I actually saw a man moving away from the window will haunt me, along with the question of their motives. Were they trying to scare me? Why, what's to stop them coming back? I, a 40-year-old woman, went to the university at Buffalo fresh out of high school in the early 2000s. At that time, the online world was a bit like the Wild West, which included having to do quite a bit more digging to find specific information than today's split-second Google search. As such, it was a much easier time for colleges and universities to hide or spin campus crime statistics to make themselves look better for prospective wallets. I mean, students. Case in point, I was at orientation a month or two before my freshman year, and one of the mass presentations I had to attend was about campus safety. Bright-faced, upperclassmen orientation aides enthusiastically verbally filleted the school, boasting about how North Campus was at the time, the safest town in the country, and that the only murder in recent history has occurred 9 years ago, to an unfortunate student named Linda Yalem who was murdered on the campus's bike path during a low early morning run. It was a fate that, we were assured, could be avoided by simply not hitting the bike path alone. What they conveniently didn't reveal was that the killer hadn't been caught and Yalem wasn't his only victim. He was a serial assaulter realtor who had already been active in the area for at least 25 years in downtown Buffalo and on the secluded bike paths of the Buffalo suburbs. In retrospect, had this information been as readily accessible as it is now, it probably would have kept me from the most bone-chilling encounter of my life. Fast forward 3 years. I was a very depressed 20-year-old who was struggling with her identity and her parents' reaction to it in a much less accepting time than now. I left school and, to avoid being home, shacked up with a woman who promised me the world but then rejected me in favor of her ex-girlfriend on the night I moved in and eventually turned out to be a felon who drained vulnerable would-be love interests' bank accounts, though that's a very convoluted story for another time. So clearly, I was an unhappy young adult desperate for love and a sense of belonging, sometimes to my own detriment. Despite my roommate's many unkind and hurtful gestures, I stuck with it in the naive hope that she would eventually come around and fulfill her pie-in-the-sky promises to me. On a particular July night, that hope just fell flat. I was at Roxy's Green Room, a now-defunct lesbian bar and club that many wayward Buffalo lesbians, myself included, flocked to at night to feel a much-needed sense of community and to hopefully land a special someone. Since the latter just wasn't happening for me, and since I didn't yet know what kind of person she really was, I was still stuck on my roommate. She liked to dangle emotional carrots overhead out of some sick joy that she got from making me hurt, but also hang on to hope. And after a promise to hit Roxy's alone with me and talk about us, she showed up with her ex turned current and shut me out. I was wounded and upset enough to leave around 1 in the morning, well before the 4 in the morning last call that I was still young and spry enough to stomach, and without a ride home like my usually wiser self would have secured. While my apartment on Delaware was walking distance from Roxy's, it was a good half-hour walk. Being as emotionally charged as I was, though, I angrily hoofed it down the main street sidewalk, still managing to follow the pedestrian rule of walking against traffic despite stupidly ignoring a rule I knew well for years, which was never leave a bar at night alone, especially if you're walking. I got exactly halfway home when a dark green sedan started driving toward me. I thought nothing of it until the car slowed down near me as I walked. A lone middle-aged man was in the car with a skin tone that I originally associated with the guy being Italian, but in retrospect, he could have easily been Puerto Rican. He had dark hair and, most importantly, almost impossibly dark eyes that seemed to hold no light of good intentions. My walk resumed. I put the guy out of my mind and I continued my trek, but the peace didn't last. About 2 or 3 minutes later, I see a familiar green car coming up on me again. This time, the guy's window was down a bit and he shouted, "Hey," in a beckoning manner and gestured in a way that made me wonder if he thought I was a lady of the night. Now that incensed me, despite my recent struggles with my identity and the resulting entropy in my life. I was always a good kid. I flashed him a quick, annoyed look to inform him that despite the mildly revealing clothing, he was barking up the wrong tree for several reasons, and then I ignored him, focusing forward. He sped off again and turned again. At that point, it was clear that the dude was casing me like a cat burglar cases a house. It was before the time of Uber or even widespread use of cell phones, and with no cabs passing by, I had little hope of getting one. Public transit existed, but it was both sparse and not running nearby. The stretches of Main between intersections were long, and I'd probably be spotted on them anyway since the guy was circling the 15 minutes away from both Roxy's and my home. There was also no way I could get anywhere near either place before the green car came back around again. The main thing I thought of was to get to an open business, inform the clerk, have him or her call the police and stay put. Then the guy would either give up or get caught. I was coming up on the convenience store on the opposite side of the street where I'd bought a pack of cigarettes earlier in the night, but as I got closer, the desolate blackness through the windows told me that it was closed. I looked around for something else, another bar, a gas station, anything, but the street was flanked by shuttered brick buildings and a locked up church. Then came the headlights and green again. Again, the guy slowed down as he approached me, but his demeanor had shifted again. He put his palm out impatiently, as if he couldn't understand my lack of complicity. "COMPILATION," the guy yelled through his now open window, his face an equal picture of aggression, intimidation, and frustration. I kept out of arm's reach on the sidewalk and once again ignored him, but this time, I was properly shaken. He angrily punched the gas and was off on his familiar circuit back around to me. Now I knew I was in trouble. The guy's behavior was escalating and I was genuinely scared that his next move would be to grab me off the sidewalk and pull me into his car. From there, God only knew what sort of depravity I was in for. I scrambled through my memory for another safety tip, and I remembered that making myself both impossible to ignore and obviously in distress could get me some much needed attention from an outside party. I ran into the middle of Main Street and started frantically waving my hands and shouting at every car that was coming my way. The first car drove by. The the second car drove by. The terror in me was palpable, as I was beginning to lose hope but still determined to keep trying while thinking of my next bold move. A van pulled over that had 4 men in it. In a game of numbers, this van full of guys was exponentially safer than that single stalker in the green car. I opted to take the gamble. I frantically told them about the man in the green car who kept circling around the block and following me, and begged for a ride home. The driver asked if I had any money in exchange for the favor. I didn't. Then he asked if I had any cigarettes. I may be one of the only people you'll ever meet who actually had her life saved by smokes. Though I had never been a smoker before, I briefly picked up the filthy habit because New York State bars still allowed smoking, and it was a weird part of Buffalo lesbian bar culture that I emulated to fit in. Yes, I answered urgently. I just bought a pack and you can have the whole thing if you get me home. Admittedly, I was initially a little miffed that the driver wanted something from me in exchange for not letting me get abducted off the street, as well as the implication that he may not have helped me if I had nothing. Still, I had the smokes, he had a vehicle, and the stars had hopefully aligned. Regardless of how it went down, I'd help if he let me in and the details didn't matter. After a second or two of thought, which seemed like an eternity to me, the driver agreed and one of the two dudes in the back opened the side door for me and got out so I could slide into the seat behind the driver. As the door to my safe carriage full of impromptu nights shut and I got buckled in, I looked out my window just in time to see the green car creeping past the van and proving to my saviors that I was telling a very disturbing true story. Until my dying day, I will never forget that man's eyes. Feeling safe surrounded by a closed van full of young, tough-looking rescuers, I looked that guy dead in the eyes. Part of me was rightfully terrified, but another part of me wanted to look right at him defiantly and tell him with my eyes, "I got away from you." I went in. I was repaid with the most evil, hateful look that I've ever had directed at me, let alone seen. His eyes were black. Black like a cat's eyes get when it sees a bug in the house and its hunting instincts cause its pupils to blow to allow more light in. But at least there's usually a hint of playful mischief in a hunting cat's eyes. The eyes I was seeing were those of a pure, unadulterated predator, and the vitriol that practically oozed from them as he glared at me let me know exactly how he felt about his prey having the audacity to elude him. He drove off into the night, and so did we, in a bit less direct route to make sure that we lost him. After a blessedly quick jaunt with frequent looks behind my shoulder, I was delivered home, one pack of cigarettes short but alive and in one piece. The first thing that I did when I got in the door was to check the locks on absolutely everything. After that, the adrenaline started to wear off and the pure fear set in. I was so terrified that the man in the green sedan was searching the area where I got dropped off that I grabbed the cordless phone, then lay completely flat on the living room floor for hours to keep totally out of sight from any of my apartment windows. As I lay there, I called the Buffalo police and relayed my terrifying tale in as much detail as I could give them. I told the cops that it was possible that the man was cruising near Roxy's to prey on vulnerable women who were out and about. In hindsight, I think the guy just saw who he thought was an easy mark out by herself and availed himself of the opportunity to strike. Fast forward another 4 years and I'd moved out to Chicago to live with my then girlfriend. For about half of my 4 years there, I was pretty homesick. I'd never lived anywhere except my home state of New York, and I went there knowing no one except my ex, who wasn't exactly an empathetic soul, adding to my feelings of isolation. I coped by keeping up on upstate New York news so I'd feel a little less far away. On a chilly mid-January morning in 2007, I was at our computer looking up headlines from my home state when one popped up that immediately snared my attention. Bike path grabber is arrested. By then, I knew the moniker well. The internet had since aged into a beautifully organized repository of knowledge. I became familiar with the Buffalo area mystery man and his active status throughout my time in Buffalo. Now I had a name for the specter responsible for that bit of eeriness that was always in the back of my mind when I was a student. The bike path grabber was revealed as Altemio Sanchez, a middle-aged native of Puerto Rico who coached his son's sports teams and was affectionately referred to as Uncle Al in his neighborhood. As with many other killers, his disguises were his community involvement and just being ordinary. The man was estimated to have been responsible for 9 different assaults around the Buffalo area since 1975 and had confessed to 3 murders: the Yale murder in 1991, a second in 1992, and a third which had occurred only 3.5 months prior to his capture. I don't know if you've ever felt your heart somehow get wedged up into your voice box and get dropped into the depths of your stomach simultaneously, but believe me when I say that it's possible, given the right catalyst. For me, that catalyst was the printed proof that the man was active while I lived in Buffalo and frequented Roxy's. He had to have at least been attempting to sate his evil impulses for those 14 years. That realization gave me a very, very bad feeling that I'd crossed paths with someone much more dangerous than I'd realized. The news article had no picture of Sanchez, but this sickening feeling in me prodded me to find one. It was almost as if I knew what I would see before I ever even looked at him. I Yahoo searched his name, because that was still a respectful means of finding things on the internet in 2007, and I was horrified, though not surprised, to see those same black, soulless, predatory eyes that I looked into 4 times on that summer night in Buffalo in 2003. The timeline fit. Altemio Sanchez pled guilty to the 3 murders and was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. In essence, the guy won't be exposed to the outside again unless he's in a body bag. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. When I was like 6 years old, I attended the elementary school, which was located in our small town. My way to and from school was basically just 500 meters of main road before turning into the street where I lived. At the time, we're talking about the late 90s here, all the parents in the town were extremely adamant on telling their kids not to trust or follow strangers. Never get into anyone's car, even if they say they know your parents and are friends. The reason why: there was a murder like 3 years back in the same town. A girl, not even 6 years old, was found dead and assaulted in a field. The strange thing about it is, nobody knows how exactly she was taken, no signs of forced entry or something, which implies somebody lured her somewhere without her suspecting a thing. The case still hasn't been solved more than 20 years later, so our parents were very afraid that their kid was going to be next, because kids can be really stupid and you can't watch them 24/7. Now onto what almost happened to me. I was walking home from elementary school. About halfway home, at the shadiest and mostly covered by trees and bushes area, a car pulled up next to me. A blonde, about 30-year-old woman was the driver. She told me she could drive me home. She claimed to be going in that direction anyway, which was, unclear to me at the time, essentially a lie because once the road ends near my house there is nothing but empty fields. Kid-like as I was not suspicious and was like, oh no, it is not that far, I can walk. Then she started being more insistent. The whole oh come on, it is fine, nothing to worry about, and you could relax instead of walking thing. The alarm bells only started ringing when she said she knew my mother, they are friends, and supposedly she was asked by her to drive me home. Thank God for my parents repeatedly talking about the tricks that people use to lure you in. I started being creeped out, continued to walk, but she kept driving beside me. Now the real weird part in hindsight was her next attempt to get me into the car. She started saying that I was obviously afraid, and cool children are not afraid of such things. If you want to be cool, you should just relax. Honestly, I did not fully realize the full extent of this situation. I just felt uncomfortable and wanted to get out of this conversation, so I just started sprinting the rest of the way back to my house. Once I got home, I stayed right next to the door and kept looking out of the window for a few minutes. And guess who drove by and basically checked out the house? That creepy woman. The road was a dead-end road, and only after 3 more minutes the car came back the same way. It took years until I realized what kind of bullet I dodged there. All I was thinking was my parents told me not to do this. I didn't know why or what that woman wanted. The drill of hearing over and over again not to believe strangers or get into their car kicked in. When I was older, I remembered this whole thing for the first time in 2 decades. Then I realized that woman was most likely sent as the trustworthy front woman to lure kids into their car and take off. Maybe she was doing this for some crazed person or human traffickers. Moral of the story is, even if your kids are too stupid or young, like I was, to comprehend such things, the rules of not following strangers and the fact that strangers will lie to you for evil intentions must be drilled into your child's head like watching both ways when crossing the road. When I was in my early 20s, I moved to Southern California with my aunt. Once I had a job established and steady income, I found an apartment that was super affordable at $350 per month plus utilities. The first red flag because California is not cheap. The other residents in the apartment were a 45-year-old man named Zach and a 45-year-old woman named Tina. They weren't a couple. Tina was a little difficult to deal with. She had very strong obsessive-compulsive disorder on a lot of things and we mostly avoided each other, but this story is about Zach and his friend Mike, who is also 45 years old. Mike and Zach were childhood friends and Mike lived in the same apartment complex as us, so he was over a lot. Every time I would come home from work, they would be polishing off a handle of vodka and then would go out. I didn't really think much of this other than, wow little lady, you sure could put it away. I wasn't super comfortable in the living situation, but it was cheap, I was in school, and I tried to make the best of it. I got along with Zach for the most part if it was just him around, but Mike was just a time bomb. Here are just a few instances that just gradually got worse over time. The first incident, Zach invited me out with Mike and another friend of theirs out to a local bar a couple of miles away. I was comfortable around Zach and I got into the passenger side of this truck. I didn't have any negative interactions with anyone until this point. Mike went ballistic in our complex parking lot about how I was selfish and had no business in the front seat because I wasn't Zach's girlfriend. It was weird because a man the same age as my dad was throwing a tantrum over the passenger seat, so I just got out and went back to my apartment. My first rain check bounced. I apologized to Zach and discussed discovered that my checks had misprinted the account number. I paid in cash and paid the bounce check fee and thought all was okay, until I got home one evening and Mike was over as normal, but starts interrogating me on why I couldn't pay my rent. I was only 22 at the time and didn't really want issues, so I was just like, hey, I apologized and took care of it. Even though Mike didn't live in the apartment, he would not let this go. He would just scream at me saying I was lazy, that I should be evicted, and on and on. The iPhone 6 came out around this time and Mike got the phone. He told me he would let me look at it if I gave him head. It was just uncomfortable and awkward. What do you even say to that when this dude is always trying to scream at you? We weren't friends and never really had a good interaction together, so I just kind of did finger guns and was like, yeah, you got me, and went into my room. It's also important to note that Mike and Zach both had 2 driving under influence charges. Zach was a school teacher and ended up being let go because of the charges. However, both men continued to drink excessively all of the time. I also had to have a key made for the lock on my bedroom door because it would get violent a lot, and that was my safety net. A lot of other instances happened, but this one takes the cake and is the point to this story. Zach and Mike had gone out and took an Uber to whatever local bar. I had gotten home and went straight to my room as always. I hear the front door swing open and Mike was pissed drunk, screaming his head off about how he lost his new phone. This guy starts beating on my bedroom door demanding to be let in because he knew I had this phone. I cracked my door open and he had stepped away from the door with his fists balled up like he was going to hit me. I told him I didn't have the phone. Mike circles back to the one time, months prior at this point, that my rent check bounced and obviously I need money. He demands that he come into my room and tear my room apart looking for said phone. I told him absolutely not and shut and locked the door. Mike started banging on my door and trying to unlock it, threatening my life, saying he was going to assault me so I could get what I deserved for being a thief. Lots of other gross and scary things. I was told if I called the police that he would beat me to a bloody pulp. This was especially scary because my aunt was my only family nearby and she wasn't really helpful. She just told me to be an adult and deal with it. Other than that, I didn't really have a support system. I told Zach a couple of days later that I would be moving out immediately and would not be paying rent for that month. Then out of Zach's dark bedroom, Mike just pops out with this creepy, sinister smile saying bye, almost taunting. I hurried into my room and locked the door. I could hear Zach blaming Mike for me moving out and Mike continued to just call me names and asking how I had the money to move out. The phone was found, for anyone who's curious. It had fallen out of his pocket in the Uber he was in, but obviously the first step to finding the phone was to flip out on me versus calling the Uber driver. This was almost a decade ago and I don't know what happened to that pair, but I wish them nothing but the worst. So Mike and Zach, I'm glad we crossed paths because it makes for a good story and I learned that if I can deal with 2 insane men, I can deal with literally anyone. I'm 14 and 1 year ago, I was subjected to abuse by my special education teacher and my math and science teacher for my entire 8th grade year. I suffer from dyslexia and I am suspected by family and my therapist to suffer from autism. I also have a history of depression and currently undiagnosed mental illness. I had told my special education teacher at the beginning of the year that I wasn't feeling okay and that I had attempted to off myself during the middle of 7th grade due to how horrible my mental state was. I got asked the basic questions: if I'm being abused at home, have I thought about doing it again, stuff like that. But what surprised me is that I wasn't sent to a mental hospital after this conversation. My parents weren't even called. I thought I got lucky because I didn't want my mom to know that I told anyone this, but I was so very wrong. I wasn't lucky at all. I had given something that this woman could use against me, something she would use against me. The next day, my special education teacher told my homeroom teacher, my math and science teacher. Now, my homeroom teacher wasn't the nicest woman. Actually, she wasn't nice at all. She yelled at kids for minor mistakes, showed favorites towards the more smarter / gifted kids, and even told the rest of us to give up on trying to even go to high school. But in my opinion, these actions were 10 times more common when it came to me. She constantly shamed me for everything, and I mean everything. My spelling, my handwriting, the way my desk was organized, how messy my hair was due to me not taking care of myself, all of it. She knew about what I was going through, what my mental state was like, and how much I hated myself for my conditions. She yelled at me despite knowing I'm sensitive to loud noise. She told me to not even bother trying to keep my grades up because I'm not going to survive in high school. She told me that I was better off in a homeless shelter because I had trouble with catching up with the rest of my classmates and that no one would want to hire me for anything. She told me to give up on art because it wouldn't do anything for me in the future, and she acted like it was my fault for failing whenever we had parent-teacher conference. Whenever I told my mom, I was left with disbelief, a punishment. Eventually during the fall, I had trouble concentrating on basic things that wasn't what I'm interested in. I'd even black out during random moments in class class, and when I woke up, a bee yelled it again and I start having a mental breakdown. She was only ever nice to me when I gave her something for special events like her birthday or holidays. Despite her unjustified hatred towards me and how badly she ruined me, I tried to get her to like me as a person. I'd give her gift after gift each holiday, showing false appreciation in the hopes of her going easy on me, but every time she'd just continue. My special education teacher wasn't much help either. She and my homeroom teacher would talk about me behind my back, saying that I'm lazy and I wouldn't make it far in the world, and that it would be better for me to give up on my future entirely. It wasn't even like they didn't know I was listening, because they did. I'd look at them in utter disbelief every time, questioning why they would say these things about a child. They know I was watching. In fact, they constantly looked at me while talking, making sure I was listening. They did this for the entire year. It was a cycle I couldn't avoid because my mom simply refused to transfer me, telling me that she'll put me in the mental hospital if I ever ask her again. I faced bullying for most of the year due to how funny it was to some of my classmates, and they even expected it to happen every day. It was so bad to the point I faked being sick just so I wouldn't have to go back, so I wouldn't have to go through this over and over again. I felt like the most useless child to ever walk the earth. I thought about how peaceful death would have been because I'd finally be free from being constantly targeted. So I became a ghost. I just sat there letting everything fall apart around me, and the only sense of freedom was art. I'd draw until it was time to go home. I started eating to put on more weight because of how some of my classmates commented on my weight and that I looked like a skeleton. But when I ate, they called me fat and I was left with throwing up my food after eating. I developed an eating disorder due to this, and if it weren't for the fact that I was born with a fast metabolism, I wouldn't look as skinny as I do now. I had enough of it one day and wrote a note in class that day saying I wanted to off myself. My special education teacher found it in my desk and asked me to come to her office to talk about the concerning nature of the note. I knew she was acting. She never cared for me past 5th grade anyways, when I was gifted and had a more bright future. After graduation, I was sent to summer school for my horrible grades and attendance. I've grown scared of my teachers there. One of them pulled me to the side, asking what was wrong, and I lost it. I cried for what seemed like forever, and my mom was called to pick me up early. I told my mom again, and this time she said that the reason why she never bothered to care, why she let me go through this, was because she was having fun in the house by herself and she didn't want me to ruin it. But she says she's sorry for letting me go through this. I love my mom, but I'll never forgive her for this, and I'll never forget what I had to go through. That entire year was bad because the people who were supposed to help me were instead breaking me down for being different. I'll never forgive those people for anything. I'm trying to learn how to love myself again. My teachers in my high school see me as a smart kid, and it's truly a blessing that I made it out of that situation alive. As for my homeroom teacher, she retired afterwards, and I have no idea where my special education teacher is now. But I hope she is doing alright in her life, because you have to be all the way screwed up to do that to a child and think it's alright. If you're liking this video, all I ask is that you make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Thank you. When I graduated from college and got my first job, I was thrilled to move into my own place. I found a cozy apartment in an older building. The rent was within my budget, and the area was reputed to be safe, with the added bonus of being close to work. The building had 4 floors. I lived on the 3rd floor, and below me there was a similar apartment that had been vacant for a while. A month after moving in, the landlord informed me that the 2nd floor apartment had been rented out. The first time I met my new neighbor, I was coming back from work. He introduced himself as Greg. He was a tall man with a scruffy beard and intense, searching eyes. He greeted me with a warm smile, which didn't quite reach those eyes. "I'm right below you," he said, pointing towards his door. "If you ever need anything or if I'm too loud, just let me know." I smiled and thanked him, thinking how considerate he was. Over the next few weeks, I'd occasionally bump into Greg in the hallway or the parking lot. He'd always stop to chat, asking about my day, my work, my family. Initially, his interests seemed friendly, but after a while, his questions became oddly specific. He'd ask about my routine, my friends, the places I like to visit. Alarm bells started ringing in my mind. Then strange things began to happen. I'd come home to find my mail disturbed. Sometimes, I'd be sure I'd closed a window, only to return and find it open. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of something scratching at my door. I rushed to look through the peephole but saw nothing. However, the most disturbing thing was the noise from Greg's apartment. Late at night, I'd often hear tapping sounds from the floor beneath my bedroom. They'd start slow and rhythmic and then get faster and louder. The first few times, I brushed it off as some DIY project Greg was undertaking, but it persisted almost every night. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, the tapping started again, but this time, something was different. It wasn't just beneath my bedroom, it moved, following the exact path I walked. If I moved to the kitchen, the tapping would relocate right beneath my feet. I felt like he was tracking my every move from the apartment below. Terrified, I decided to confide in a close friend, Lisa. She suggested setting up a discreet webcam in my apartment just to check if someone was indeed entering my place while I was away. The next day, the camera was in place. At work, my phone buzzed with a notification. I had set the camera to alert me with motion detection. Heart pounding, I clicked on the link. The live feed showed my living room, and Greg, standing right in the middle, holding a stethoscope to my ceiling. He was using it to listen to my movements above. Horrified, I called the police, who arrived at the apartment building shortly. They confronted Greg, and a search of his apartment revealed a set of master keys, including one to my place. It turned out he had a history of stalking behaviors and had served time previously. My landlord was oblivious to his past. The days that followed were a blur of police statements, shifting to a new place, and countless sleepless nights. Every little noise would make me jump. I would double and triple check my locks before going to bed, only to wake up multiple times to check them again. Sleep became elusive, and my life revolved around a constant state of anxiety. My friends and family were incredibly supportive during this time. Lisa, in particular, was my rock. She helped me find a therapist who specialized in trauma. During my therapy sessions, I learned about the psychological effects of stalking and how common it was for victims to feel a loss of control over their own lives. One day, Lisa suggested joining a support group for victims of stalking and trauma. It might help to share your story and hear from others who've been through similar experiences, she reasoned. The idea wasn't appealing at first, but eventually, I thought it might be beneficial. The support group was a mix of men and women of various ages, all of whom had their own harrowing stories. There was Sarah, who had been stalked by an ex-boyfriend for years before he was finally arrested. Then there was Mike, who had been cyberstalked by a former coworker. The stories varied, but the emotions were the same: fear, anger, and a sense of violation. Sharing my story with the group was cathartic. They understood the anxiety, the feeling of constantly looking over my shoulder. The group provided tips on ensuring personal safety, regaining a sense of control, and rebuilding one's life after trauma. As the months went by, my confidence began to grow. I moved into a new apartment, this time ensuring I did thorough background checks on all the residents. I took self-defense classes and learned about online privacy to safeguard myself from potential cyber threats. One evening, as I was leaving a session from the support group, a woman approached me. "Hi, I'm Emily," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I heard your story today. It's my first time here. I wanted to say thank you. Hearing you speak gave me the strength to share my own experience next time." Her words struck a chord in me. I realized that by facing my fears and sharing my story, I was not only helping myself but also giving strength to others. It was a turning point, a realization that every dark cloud has a silver lining. Over the next few years, with the help of therapy and the support group, I found my footing again. I became an advocate for victims of stalking, raising awareness about the psychological impact of such experiences and the importance of taking stalking incidents seriously. Life moved on, and though the memories of Greg in that terrifying time never fully faded, they no longer held power over me. Instead, they served as a reminder of my strength and resilience. And while I hope to never meet Greg or anyone like him again, I was now better prepared to face any challenges that came my way. The city park, with its vast landscapes and bustling crowds, had always been a safe haven for me. After long hours at the office, I would make my way there to sit on a particular bench and read a book, letting the natural surroundings wash away the stresses of the day. One Friday evening, I was engrossed in a thriller novel. The sun had set, casting a dim hue around the park, the shadows growing longer. Most regulars had left, replaced by couples taking evening strolls or joggers on their last lap. I was so deep into my book that I didn't notice the man who had sat down on the other end of the bench. He looked to be in his late 40s, wearing a tattered coat and a dirty hat pulled low, concealing most of his face. He reeked of alcohol and stale cigarettes. For the most part, he just sat there, mumbling to himself and occasionally chuckling. Feeling uneasy, I marked my page, intending to leave. But as I started to get up, he turned to me. "Nice night, isn't it?" he rasped, trying to be polite. I nodded, murmured an agreement, and began walking away. I had barely taken 10 steps when he called out, "You shouldn't be alone here, miss. Not safe." The tone, more than the words, sent a chill down my spine. Picking up my pace, I tried to convince myself that he was just a harmless drunk. but when I glanced back, I saw him following, his gait uneven but determined. Panicking, I decided to head towards the more populated side of the park. My heart raced as I heard his footsteps growing louder, and I realized he was now running. A quick look around showed that the park, which was usually filled with laughter and people, was eerily silent save for the soft crickets and our echoing footsteps. I thought about calling out, but who would hear me? Instead, I dug into my purse and found my phone. Dialing 911, I started narrating my situation in a hushed tone, all the while power walking toward the exit. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and head to a more populated area, assuring me that police were en route. Suddenly, from a nearby pathway, a group of teenagers on bikes appeared. Seizing the opportunity, I yelled out to them, explaining that I was being followed. They instantly formed a protective barrier around me, with two of them trying to confront the man. Startled by this sudden interference, the man halted, raising his hands in a mock surrender, muttering about just wanting to chat. But his eyes, dark and unyielding, told a different story. The police arrived minutes later, and I was beyond relieved. They detained the man, who turned out to be a no petty criminal with a record of harassment and assaults. The teenagers stayed with me, providing statements to the police and ensuring I was okay. I thanked them profusely, realizing that their timely intervention might have saved me from a far more terrifying ordeal. Weeks turned into months, and while the initial shock and fear began to fade, I became more active in community initiatives. My near miss had awakened a newfound determination to ensure that such situations were minimized for others. I began attending neighborhood meetings, pushing for increased security measures in the park. A few others, having heard my story, joined the cause. Together, we lobbied for better lighting, more frequent patrolling by security personnel, and the installation of emergency call stations at various points within the park. Around this time, I met Sarah, a woman in her late 20s who had experienced a similar incident a year before mine. She had been jogging in the park early one morning when she was approached and harassed by an unknown man. Her experience, combined with mine, became a driving force in our campaign for a safer community. With Sarah by my side, we started organizing self-defense classes for women in our community center. These classes not only provided physical training but also offered a platform for many women to share their stories, fostering a supportive environment. As our initiatives gained traction, the local news caught wind of our efforts. Sarah and I were invited to speak about the importance of community vigilance and personal safety. This public platform provided an avenue to reach a larger audience, emphasizing the importance of being proactive rather than reactive in matters of personal security. One evening, after wrapping up a self-defense class, a young woman named Claire approached us. Tearfully, she explained that she had been assaulted 2 years ago and had since lived in constant fear, rarely leaving her house. Our classes and community initiatives had inspired her to reclaim her life. She wanted to help others and expressed a desire to become a self-defense instructor. Seeing the positive ripple effect of our efforts was heartwarming. Claire's journey from a traumatized victim to an empowered individual ready to help others was a testament to the power of community support. While the park bench encounter had been one of the darkest moments of my life, the subsequent journey had illuminated the strength, resilience, and unity of our community. They reaffirmed the belief that, in the face of adversity, collective effort can bring about meaningful change. However, the park always remained a poignant reminder of that fateful evening. Even with the security improvements, I rarely ventured there alone. But one day, almost a year after the incident, Sarah and I decided to revisit our favorite park bench. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the park, eerily reminiscent of that evening. As we sat there, lost in our thoughts, a patrol officer passed by, nodding with a reassuring smile. The newly installed lights began to illuminate the pathways, and the distant sound of an emergency call station being tested filled the air. We had come full circle, transforming our fears into a force for positive change. As we left the park, arm in arm, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for my escape on that terrifying night, but for the journey of empowerment and community building that had followed. That bench, which had once symbolized fear and vulnerability, now stood as a testament to resilience, community spirit, and the belief that even in our darkest moments, there's an opportunity to shine a light for others. I had just graduated college and moved to the city, taking a job at a prominent marketing firm. The job was exciting but demanding, often requiring late nights at the office. The adrenaline of young ambition often pushed me to burn the midnight oil. One particular Thursday, I was running through a presentation scheduled for Friday morning. It took longer than I anticipated, and I glanced at the wall clock, 11:53 p.m. I grabbed my stuff in haste, not wanting to miss the last train home. As I entered the subway station, I was grateful to find it wasn't completely deserted. A few stragglers like myself hurried about. I boarded the train, selecting a seat near the door for an easy exit. The car had a smattering of passengers, a weary-looking nurse, a college kid with earbuds, an elderly man who seemed lost in his memories, and a few others. A couple of stops in, a man boarded. He was tall, gaunt, with a greasy mane of hair. His coat, which had seen better days, had stains that I couldn't quite identify, but what unsettled me were his eyes, unnaturally blue and piercing. He scanned the train and, despite several empty seats, chose the one directly opposite mine. I buried my nose in my book, trying to avoid eye contact, but I could feel him staring. Each time I dared to glance up, his gaze was locked onto me. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unnerving. The weight of his attention felt almost physical. At the next stop, the college kid and the nurse exited, leaving just a handful of us in the car. The man took this opportunity to shift closer to me. Not wanting to seem rude or paranoid, I tried to continue reading, reminding myself that the city was full of quirky personalities. The following stop approached, and I readied myself to exit, even though it wasn't my stop. But as the doors slid open, the man suddenly sprang to his feet, blocking my path. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" he asked, his voice raspy, almost mocking. Unsure how to respond, I mumbled a vague agreement, trying to sidestep him. He shifted, still obstructing my way, his gaze never leaving mine. The elderly man, who was sitting a few seats away, called out, "Is everything okay over there?" The man's gaze snapped to him, his lips curling into a disdainful sneer. Taking advantage of his distraction, I bolted from the train, nearly tripping in my haste. Emerging into the night, I took a moment to steady my racing heart, but as I made my way to the exit, I heard rapid footsteps behind me. Dare I look back? The echo of those footsteps was growing louder and closer. Panicking, I decided on a risky move. Instead of exiting the station, I circled back and headed towards the opposite platform. I heard a train approaching and, praying it would stop, I sprinted. The footsteps behind me didn't falter. The train pulled in just in time, and I jumped on board, not caring about the destination. As the doors closed, I looked out, half expecting to see the man's haunting blue eyes, but he was nowhere in sight. Relief washed over me, replaced immediately by embarrassment. Had I overreacted? The next day at work, a colleague noticed my exhausted appearance and asked if everything was alright. Hesitantly, I recounted my harrowing experience. She listened, her face pale, and then pulled up a news article on her computer. The article was about a man who had been released from prison a month ago, having served time for several violent crimes. The police believed he was connected to a few recent disappearances in the city, but they had no solid evidence yet. The article was accompanied by a mugshot. The following weeks were a blur. Work was busier than ever, but I found solace in my new routine, waking up early, walking to work, and returning home well before sunset. My colleagues noticed my change in habits, but most respected my desire to keep my reasons private. However, the few that knew about my subway encounter constantly checked up on me. Olivia, a close friend from work, suggested I attend a self-defense class she'd been raving about. Though initially hesitant, I eventually agreed, realizing that it might help rebuild the confidence I'd lost that night. The first session was surprisingly therapeutic. Our instructor, a burly woman named Rosa, preached the importance of intuition, echoing the same sentiment that had saved me. Always trust your instincts. With each class, I felt a renewed sense of empowerment and security. One evening, as I was practicing a particularly tricky move with Olivia, Rosa approached us. "You're doing well," she commented, appraising our technique. She then turned to me, her expression turning serious. "Olivia mentioned your subway incident. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. I've worked with many women who have had close encounters, and talking about it often helps." The genuine concern in Rosa's eyes was comforting. We spent the next hour discussing not just my ordeal, but also her experiences teaching self-defense. She spoke of countless women who, like me, had faced danger and, as a result, had chosen to equip themselves with the tools needed to protect themselves. One story that stood out was of a woman named Clara who'd been followed home one night by a stalker. Instead of panicking, she'd used the techniques learned in Rosa's class to fend him off and even managed to detain him until the police arrived. "These stories are more common than you think," Rosa said, "but what's crucial is how you move forward. It's not about living in fear, but in empowerment." Feeling inspired, Olivia and I decided to initiate a workshop at our office, partnering with Rosa. The aim was to equip both men and women with basic self-defense skills and promote situational awareness. The response was overwhelming. What started as a small initiative became a monthly event, with participants even bringing their families. A few months later, as Olivia and I were setting up for another workshop, a news alert popped up on my phone. The man with the piercing blue eyes had been apprehended. He'd been caught in the act of attempting to abduct a young woman near another subway station. The woman had fought back fiercely, drawing attention attention to her situation and leading to his capture. While the news brought a sense of closure, it also reinforced the importance of the work we were doing. My harrowing encounter had led to a newfound purpose, educating and empowering others to trust their instincts and protect themselves. Life in the city resumed its bustling rhythm, but for me, it was different. The shadows of that chilly night remained, but they were now accompanied by the glow of resilience, empowerment, and a community that looked out for each other. The city's tales of dark alleys and lurking dangers were now countered with stories of strength, unity, and people ready to stand up against the shadows. For most medical students in the US, the fourth year marks a series of adventures across the country, interviewing for residency programs in their chosen field. That year, I was 25 and buzzing with anticipation, but one particular trip would forever remind me to always be cautious, even in the most unsuspecting places. My journey began in Boston, heading to Detroit. I had never been to Michigan before and looked forward to the experience. The flight was uneventful, and upon landing, I hailed a cab to take me to a budget motel, the only place I could afford on my student loans. The motel was a 2-story building that had seen better days. My room was on the first floor, facing the parking lot. Inside, the room was dim, with a faint odor of cigarettes, despite the no smoking sign. I unpacked, reviewing my notes for the next day's interview, when there was a soft knock on the door. Standing outside was a man, probably in his 42nd, dressed in a worn-out flannel shirt and jeans. "Hey there," he greeted, a crooked smile forming. "I'm Dave from the next room. Saw you checking in earlier. Here for business." Caught off guard, I responded, "Oh yeah, here for an interview." Dave's eyes seemed to linger a bit too long. "Medical student, right? I've seen a few of you guys here before. Got any plans tonight?" Feeling uneasy, I replied, "Thanks, but I'm resting tonight. Big day tomorrow." Dave nodded, still smiling. "Well, if you need company or anything, just knock." "Sure," I replied, closing the door gently. I added the chain lock for good measure. Shrugging off the odd encounter, I settled into bed, setting an alarm for 6 a.m. As I began to drift off, I was jolted awake by a tapping sound. Peeking through the blinds, I spotted Dave sitting on the hood of his car, staring at my window and tapping a metal rod against his shoe. I pulled back, heart racing. "Just ignore him," I whispered to myself, hoping he'd get bored and leave. The tapping continued intermittently for what felt like hours before it finally stopped. Exhausted, I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up to the blaring of my alarm. Groggily, I silenced it and began my morning routine. I cautiously checked outside, no sign of Dave. Breathing a sigh of relief, I made my way to the interview, which went surprisingly well given the previous night's events. The day was filled with hospital tours, meetings with residents, and Q&A sessions. By the end of it, I was exhausted, but my nerves spiked when I remembered I had to return to the motel. Arriving back, I was relieved not to see Dave's car. Perhaps he had checked out. As I entered my room, I decided to call the front desk, just to be safe. "Hello, I wanted to ask about the guest in the room next to mine. Is he still checked in?" The receptionist paused. "You may roommate." "No, he checked out this morning." "Why do you ask?" I felt a chill. "No reason, thanks." Closing the call, I turned to my bed and froze. There, placed neatly on the pillow, was a surgical scalpel and a note. "Thought you might need this, Dave." I bolted out of the room, sprinted to the front desk, and demanded they call the police. The officers arrived shortly after, and after inspecting the room and taking my statement, advised me to stay elsewhere for the night. The following day, the police informed me that the scalpel had been stolen from a local medical supply store. Dave had apparently used fake identification to check into the motel, and they had no leads on his real identity. I immediately contacted my school's administration about the incident, and they were horrified. They had an emergency meeting with all the fourth-year students, warning them about the potential dangers during their residency interview travels. They even started a program where alumni in various cities would offer to host current students during their interview trips, ensuring a safer environment. I was overwhelmed by the support from my peers. Olivia, a classmate I wasn't particularly close with before the incident, became a crucial part of my support system. She had family in Detroit and felt guilty that she hadn't offered me a place to stay. We bonded over this traumatic experience, and she became a rock in my life. It took some time, but I slowly began to move past the incident. The police continued their investigation, but with no strong leads on Dave, it eventually became a cold case. However, the motel did amp up its security measures, installing cameras all around the property. My residency interviews wrapped up, and soon it was match day, the day all medical students find out where they will spend their residency years. The apprehension I felt opening that envelope was different different from the one in Detroit, but intense nonetheless. When I saw that I matched into my top choice in Boston, I was ecstatic. Olivia matched into a program in Chicago. We promised each other that no matter where life took us, we'd always have each other's backs. Years passed, and the horrifying memory of that Detroit trip began to fade. I was flourishing in my residency program, working long hours but deeply fulfilled by the work. Olivia and I kept our promise, always checking in on each other despite the distance. One day, during my third year of residency, I received a package at the hospital. Thinking it was medical equipment, I didn't rush to open it, but when I did, my heart stopped. Inside was a familiar-looking metal rod, the same one that Dave had tapped against his shoe that fateful night. The memories flooded back instantly, and I felt a deep, gnawing dread in the pit of my stomach. Attached to the rod was a note, "Still thinking of you." Terrified, I immediately contacted the hospital security and the local police. They took the package into evidence, hoping to find any fingerprints or DNA that could lead them to Dave. Olivia was the first person I called. She was as horrified as I was and immediately booked a flight to Boston to be with me. Weeks turned into months, and the police still had no new leads. I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. Olivia suggested I see a therapist to cope with the anxiety, and it was one of the best decisions I made. Through therapy, I learned techniques to deal with my trauma, reminding myself that I was not a helpless student anymore but a strong, competent doctor. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, I was surprised to find a bouquet of flowers waiting for me in my apartment. Confused, I looked for a card. The message read, "Congratulations on making it this far. Always here for you, Dave." This was the last straw. I couldn't live in fear anymore. I decided to hire a private investigator, hoping they could uncover something the police missed. The investigator dove deep into the case, combing through security footage, motel records, and even tracking down previous guests who had stayed near room A. Weeks later, he called me with surprising news. He had traced back a pattern of incidents similar to mine, targeting female medical students. Each incident was in a different city at a different motel, but the descriptions of the man were eerily similar. The investigator believed that this man, Dave, was moving from city to city, specifically targeting medical students. It seemed that he had an obsession or grudge against female medical professionals. With this new information, the police reopened the investigation. A nationwide alert was sent out to all medical schools, warning students and urging anyone with information to come forward. The power of the medical community was evident. Tips and stories began pouring in from all corners of the country. And then, a break in the case, a motel manager in Nashville recognized the description of Dave and provided security footage of him checking in. The manhunt was on. Within days, with the combined efforts of several state police departments, they located and arrested Dave in a small town in Ohio. As it turned out, he had a deep-seated resentment towards the medical profession due to a botched surgery that left him in chronic pain. Though it was a relief knowing he was behind bars, the trauma left a lasting impact on me. I became an advocate for the safety of medical students on the interview trail, launching initiatives to ensure no one would have to face such terror again. Olivia and I continued our close bond, always reminding each other of the strength we drew from that harrowing experience. The dark chapter of Dave was behind us, but its lessons on vigilance, community, and resilience would stay with us forever. It was the summer of 2012 when I started my internship in New York City. Excited and slightly overwhelmed by the bustling streets, I tried to acclimate to the fast-paced environment as quickly as possible. I rented a basement apartment in Queens, and my daily routine involved taking the subway to Manhattan where the company's office was located. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I was waiting for the subway at Grand Central. The platform was crowded, and I was immersed in a book when I felt someone watching me. I glanced up to see a man staring at me intently from across the platform. He was in his late 42nd, balding, with a tan trench coat and worn-out shoes. I brushed off the uneasy feeling, thinking it was probably a coincidence. The train arrived, and I boarded, taking a seat near the window. As the subway doors closed, I caught a glimpse of the same man boarding the same car. Again, I brushed it off. After all, it's New York, there are millions of people and countless coincidences. The journey from Grand Central to Queens was about 40 minutes. As I approached my stop, I gathered my things and stood up, noticing the man doing the same. A little voice inside my head told me to be alert, so instead of heading straight to my apartment, I decided to stop by a local grocery store. The man followed. I browsed the aisles, picked up a few items, and kept an eye on the man who pretended to shop but watched me through the gaps between the shelves. Growing increasingly nervous, I approached a store employee and explained my situation. She immediately called for the manager, who then confronted the man. They had a brief discussion, after which the man quickly left the store. The manager offered to have an employee walk me home, which I gratefully accepted. I thought that would be the end of it, but the next day, as I was leaving work, I saw him again. He was standing on the opposite side of the street, watching. Panicking, I rushed to the nearest police station and reported the incidents. They took my statement and assured me they would look into it. An officer also gave me some advice on staying safe, such as varying my routine and being aware of my surroundings. Over the next couple of weeks, I spotted the man multiple times outside my office, near my apartment, and even once at a coffee shop I frequented. I reported each sighting to the police, and they began actively investigating. One evening, a detective called me to inform that they had identified the man. He had a history of stalking behavior and had been arrested previously. With the evidence I provided, the police arrested him again. A restraining order was issued, and I was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. I never saw him again, but the experience forever changed how I viewed my personal safety in big cities. Several months passed, and life resumed its normal pace. The haunting memories of the persistent stranger began to fade, replaced with new friendships, work successes, and the daily ebb and flow of city life. But the lesson of that summer never left me: the importance of vigilance in urban environments. On weekends, I began attending self-defense classes. The studio, nestled between a vintage bookstore and a quirky cafe, quickly became a haven for me. The instructor, a robust woman named Alina, had a fierce demeanor, but she also possessed a nurturing spirit that made her instantly likable. It was at one of these classes that I met Maya, a journalist who had faced her own share of unsolicited attention during field assignments. We bonded over shared experiences and our commitment to personal safety. Maya introduced me to an app she had found that allowed users to share their live location with trusted contacts. Whenever one of us felt unsafe or wanted someone to know our whereabouts, we'd activate it. It was a small but reassuring step. One Saturday, after an intensive sparring session, Maya and I decided to grab coffee at the cafe next door. As we sipped on our lattes and chatted, a local news story played on the TV. The reporter was discussing the recent spike in reports from women who felt they were being followed. Maya, with her journalist's instincts, decided to delve deeper. Over the next few weeks, she interviewed dozens of women, gathering stories that vary from harmless coincidences to sinister encounters. I helped where I could, leveraging my recent experience and the connections I'd made with the police. Our research culminated in a powerful article that Maya titled "The Shadows of the City When Being Watched Becomes Dangerous." The piece went viral, sparking citywide conversations about women's safety and prompting local authorities to ramp up security measures in certain hotspots. A community group emerged from these discussions, dedicated to ensuring safety in the neighborhood. Evening patrols were organized, with volunteers making their presence known in vulnerable areas during peak times. Local businesses, including the cafe and the bookstore beside my self-defense studio, began offering their premises as safe spaces for anyone feeling threatened. Alina, ever the community stalwart, started offering free self-defense workshops for women. The studio was perpetually packed, with women of all ages eager to empower themselves. The efforts of our tight-knit community were palpable. Over time, there was a marked decrease in the number of incidents reported. Women felt safer, more protected, and most importantly, heard. The incident with the stranger, though terrifying at the time, set off a chain of events that brought our community closer. We had transformed our collective fear into a proactive stance against potential threats. Years later, as I packed up my basement apartment in Queens and prepared to move to a new city, I reflected on my time in New York. The city had taught me resilience, the importance of community, and to always trust my instincts. Wherever life took me next, I was ready, armed not just with self-defense moves, but with the knowledge that when communities come together, they have the power to effect real, lasting change. I had moved to my apartment complex in downtown Austin about 2 years ago. The convenience of being within walking distance to work and local cafes was unbeatable. Every morning, I'd take the same route, walking past the same stores and coffee shops, waving hello to the familiar faces, and just reveling in the beauty of my urban routine. The thing about routines, though, is that they make you predictable. It started with the notes. One evening, I came back to find a small crumpled paper under my door. "You look nice today," it read. At first, I thought it was just a harmless note, perhaps from a secret admirer or a neighbor trying to be friendly. But the notes continued, growing more detailed and intimate. "Loved how your hair looked in the wind today," one read. Another said, "You should wear that blue sweater more often." Concerned but not wanting to overreact, I decided to adjust my schedule, leave for work at different times, and even take different routes. That's when I started to notice him. A tall man, always wearing a baseball cap, and consistently in my peripheral vision. It was Ari. I'd never seen his face entirely, but he was always there, watching. One evening, as I was heading back from a late late dinner, I noticed him again. The streets were more deserted than usual, and my heart raced as I quickened my pace, the echo of his footsteps mirroring mine. Panicking, I ducked into a bookstore I often frequented, hoping to lose him amongst the aisles. Mary, an elderly woman who owned the store, noticed my distress and approached. "I think someone's following me," I whispered to her. Her face grew concerned, and she immediately guided me to the back of the store, out of view. About 10 minutes passed, which felt like hours. Peeking out, I couldn't spot him. With Mary's insistence, I decided to call the police. 2 officers arrived shortly and took my statement, but without any clear evidence or a description of the man, there wasn't much they could do. They did, however, offer to patrol the area and ensure I got home safely. A few days passed without incident, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I began second-guessing every decision, became more withdrawn, and my once-loved routine became a source of anxiety. One day, as I was going through my old yearbooks, a memory hit me like a ton of bricks. Back in high school, there was a guy, Jake, 2 years my senior. He had developed an unhealthy obsession with me, always staring from a distance, leaving notes in my locker, and even following me home once. The school had intervened, and he was expelled. It was an incident I had pushed to the recesses of my mind. Curious, I decided to look Jake up on social media. After a few clicks, I stumbled upon his profile, and my blood ran cold. There he was, older now but unmistakably Jake, and his latest post was a picture of a baseball cap. I immediately called the police again and provided them with the information. They decided to bring him in for questioning, and it turned out my suspicions were correct. Jake had recognized me on the street one day and decided to reignite his twisted fascination. He had moved to Austin a few years earlier and had been leading a relatively low-profile life, but spotting me had triggered his old habits. With the evidence in hand, the police were able to issue a restraining order against Jake. The next few months were tough. The realization that I had been stalked by someone from my past, someone with whom I had shared hallways and classrooms, was chilling. However, the incident made me appreciate the importance of community. My neighbors, the local store owners, even strangers, rallied around me, ensuring that I felt safe and supported. The bookstore became a regular haunt, with Mary always ready with a comforting word and a cup of tea. The experience was a brutal reminder of the unpredictability of life, but also showcased the kindness of people. In the months that followed, Austin started to feel like home again. The unease faded gradually, replaced by newfound confidence and strength. Friends and neighbors were always checking in, ensuring that I was okay, and the incident had spawned a stronger sense of unity within the community. As the group's workshops gained traction, more and more residents attended, sharing their stories and experiences. I realized that while my encounter with Jake was unique in its nature, many others had faced similar situations. Some had been stalked, others had faced break-ins, while some just felt unsafe walking alone at night. The community came together, shared personal experiences, and started looking out for one another. One evening, as I was winding up a workshop, a young woman, Lily, approached me. Her eyes were filled with a mix of fear and determination. "I think I'm being followed," she confided. I remembered the fear I had felt, and I knew precisely how she was feeling. We immediately informed the police and collaborated with them to identify the stalker. With the help of the community and the local patrol officers, we were able to catch the man in question. It turned out he was a repeat offender who had just been released from prison and had taken to his old habits. Lily was grateful, and I was reminded once more of the importance of community vigilance. Lily and I formed a close bond after that incident. We became each other's pillar of strength. She joined our community safety group, and together we initiated several projects, including safety walks for women, self-defense classes, and a helpline for those who felt threatened. Over the next year, crime rates in our neighborhood decreased significantly. Local businesses pitched in, sponsoring events, and offering rewards for community members who actively contributed to making Austin safer. As for me, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. My daily routine was almost the same, but with one difference: I now walked with an extra spring in my step, knowing that I was not alone, that I was part of a community that cared, watched out for each other, and wouldn't let darkness overshadow the light. Jake's memory became just that, a memory, a grim reminder of a chapter in my life that had been challenging, but also transformative. Every now and then, I'd visit Mary's bookstore. We'd sip on tea and chat about everything under the sun. Mary often remarked how the incident had changed me. "You were always strong," she'd say, "but now you shine." And she was right. The ordeal with Jake had taken me on a journey from fear to empowerment, from being watched to watching out for others. It had taught me the importance of community, resilience, and the indomitable human spirit. The experience had carved out a part of me, but in its place, it had filled me with purpose, compassion, and an unwavering determination to ensure that no one else felt as alone and scared as I once did. The community had rallied together, not just for me, but for everyone. Austin became more than just a city. It became a symbol of unity, strength, and the profound impact that collective effort can have in erasing shadows and lighting up lives. The town of Ravensbrück is one of those places you can't find on a modern map. When I stumbled across it on my road trip, it was purely by accident. I was headed towards the national parks in the west, and perhaps out of fatigue or pure curiosity, I found myself driving down a narrow, windy road that had seen better days. The journey to Ravensbrück was marked by eerie expanses of dense woods and the encroaching feeling of isolation. However, as I approached the town, it felt as if I'd stepped back in time. Classic 1950s style houses, an old gas station, and even a diner that boasted best burgers since 1958 all greeted me upon arrival. But there was something unusual about this quaint picture. There was no one around. No children playing, no cars driving by, not even the hum of an old-timey radio. Intrigued, I parked my car outside the diner. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. The inside felt cozy, decorated with vintage posters and red vinyl chairs. Again, eerily, it was devoid of people except for a lone woman behind the counter. She was in her 50s, with silver hair tied into a bun and a stern, almost cold demeanor. She eyed me suspiciously. "Lost it?" she asked. "Just passing through," I responded, trying to sound casual. "Thought I'd grab a coffee." She nodded slowly, pouring me a cup without breaking her gaze. I tried to make small talk, asking about the town's history and why it was so quiet. She said Ravensbrück had seen better days, but people moved on, leaving only memories behind. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed old black and white photographs on the walls. Most depicted happy families and lively town events, but one particular photo caught my eye. It showed a group of children, all around 10 or 12, standing in front of a forest. They were all looking at something or someone off frame, expressions of terror etched into their young faces. Feeling a chill run down my spine, I asked the woman about it. She hesitated, then whispered, "That's the last photo taken of them before they disappeared. It was the day Ravensbrück changed forever." Curious, I pressed for more details. The woman seemed reluctant, but finally relented. She began telling the tale of a man named Nathan, who had once lived on the outskirts of town. Nathan was a recluse, known to wander the woods, and was often the topic of local gossip and children's ghost stories. One summer day, the children in the photograph had decided to venture into the woods, chasing after legends of hidden treasures. But as evening fell, they didn't return. Search parties were formed, and the townspeople combed every inch of the forest. Nathan was found at a clearing, surrounded by symbols drawn in the dirt and muttering incoherently. The children, however, were never found. The town turned on Nathan, blaming him for the children's disappearance. Without a trial, he was locked in an old barn and left to meet a grim fate. Since that day, the once vibrant town of Ravensbrück began its slow descent into quiet despair. "The town's been cursed ever since," the woman murmured. "Every few years, someone disappears. And every time, the same symbols found around Nathan appear somewhere in town." I felt a cold dread as she continued, "You do well to leave before nightfall." I quickly paid for my coffee, thanking her for the story. As I left, she called out, "Stay on the main road and don't venture into the woods." Driving away from Ravensbrück, the sky darkened. Despite the early hour, it felt as if night was rapidly descending. Suddenly, my car sputtered and died, leaving me stranded on that old, windy road. Panicking, I tried the ignition multiple times, but it was useless. In the distance, I heard a soft, childlike giggle. My heart raced as I locked the car doors. The giggles grew louder, turning into multiple voices whispering and laughing. Then, in my headlights, symbols began to appear on the road, drawn as if by invisible hands. Remembering the woman's warning, I decided to abandon the car and run. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away. The voices grew louder and more sinister as if they were right behind me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but fear propelled me forward. After what felt like hours, I saw lights ahead. Gasping for breath, I stumbled onto the main road, and to my immense relief, a trucker pulled over. He saw my panicked state and let me in without a word. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods. For a split second, I saw figures of children standing at the edge, with Nathan looming behind them. The trucker dropped me off at the next town. I thanked him profusely, still in shock. He just nodded, mentioning that he had heard stories of Ravensbrück but never believed them. It took days to recover my car, and when I did, those eerie symbols were etched onto every window. I sold the car immediately and took a flight back home, leaving the West behind. My friends and family could tell that something had deeply affected me, though I never shared the full story, believing they might dismiss it as a hallucination or stress-induced fantasy. One evening, after a particularly rough day at work, I decided to distract myself with some online research about Ravensbrück. The web yielded very little. There was no Wikipedia page, no travel reviews, not even a ghost story site mention. It was as if the town had been completely wiped off the face of the internet. However, buried deep in the search results, I stumbled across an old forum. The title read, "Ravensbrück, the Cursed Town." There were a handful of entries, most of which were users sharing third or fourth hand stories, but one post, dated just a week back, caught my attention. I was there. It began. The user described an experience eerily similar to mine. The isolated town, the vintage diner, the ominous woman with silver hair. and the haunting photograph of terrified children. Their encounter ended with a car breakdown, ghostly voices, and a narrow escape. The story ended with the line, "And every night since, I feel like they are watching, waiting." Chills ran down my spine as I read it. I quickly replied to the post, sharing a condensed version of my experience and asking if we could connect privately. Within minutes, a message notification popped up. The user, who introduced himself as Alex, explained how he had been on a photography expedition looking for forgotten towns and landscapes. Like me, he had stumbled upon Ravensbrück by accident. The trauma of the experience had left him sleepless, and he had turned to the internet for answers, leading to the creation of his forum post. We decided to set up a video call. Alex looked worn out, with dark circles under his eyes indicating countless sleepless nights. As we shared our experiences, the similarities were uncanny, and the one thread that tied our stories together was the sense of being watched, even weeks after leaving Ravensbrück. It was Alex who suggested we should try to find more survivors like us. Maybe, collectively, we could find a way to break the cycle or at least make sense of it. Our online searches led us to a few more, and soon we had a small group of 6 who had experienced the horrors of Ravensbrück. The more we shared, the more we began to notice patterns. Each person had an object with the eerie symbols from Ravensbrück. For Alex, it was his camera. For me, it was a small metal keychain I had absent-mindedly picked up at the gas station in town. These objects seemed to be the link that kept us connected to the haunting memories and eerie occurrences that followed our visits. One of our group members, a woman named Clara, proposed a plan. She had connections with a well-known psychic known for cleansing haunted objects and locations. We all agreed to meet, bringing our cursed items, hoping this might be the key to ending the nightmares. The day of the ritual was tense. The psychic, an older woman named Esme, examined each object. She confirmed what we suspected. They held a connection to the town and were infused with the energy of the lost souls of Ravensbrück. Esme's process was intense, invoking spirits and energies I had never experienced before. One by one, our objects were cleansed, with each ritual ending in a bright flash of light. When it was over, an overwhelming sense of relief washed over us. The weight we had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. Months have passed since that day. The nightmares and eerie feelings have stopped. The group disbanded, with each of us returning to our lives, forever changed by our shared experience. Ravensbrück remains a mystery. Some in our group believe it best to leave it that way, but a part of me still yearns to know more. Was it just a cursed town, or a portal to another realm? Whatever the truth, I've learned some places on this earth are not meant to be discovered, and some memories are best left in the shadows. I grew up in a small coastal town in Maine, which was every bit the charming and picturesque place you might imagine. Cobblestone streets, white picket fences, and a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone. While it was the perfect setting for tourists, the influx of outsiders during the summer months often posed its own set of problems. This is the story of one summer I'll never forget. It started in June. The sun had begun to hang a little longer in the sky, and the waves lapped more invitingly at the shore. Tourists started pouring in, their camper vans and suitcases a common sight. My family ran a small bed and breakfast, which had been passed down for generations. The house was old, with creaky wooden floors, antique furnishings, and a history that was interwoven with the fabric of the town. One evening, as I was cleaning up the dining area after serving breakfast, I noticed a man standing outside our property. He wasn't admiring the house or looking for the entrance. He was just standing. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, slightly unkempt, with dark shades, and was observing the house as if committing every detail to memory. Feeling uneasy, I called my dad. By the time my dad got to the window, the man had moved on, his figure disappearing around a corner. Brushing it off as just another tourist, we continued our day. The following evening, after dinner, I decided to take a walk. Our town was always safe, and the idea of walking alone at night never seemed threatening. But as I made my way through the winding streets, I felt an uneasy sensation of being watched. Looking around, I spotted the same man from earlier, standing a few paces behind me. Our eyes met, and he gave a chilling, insincere smile. Panicking, I made a beeline for home. As I reached our front gate, I dared to glance back. He had stopped at the entrance of our B&B, staring intently before slipping away into the shadows. The next morning, my alarm jolted me awake. It was 6 a.m. I had a routine of going for a run on the beach every morning, but given last night's encounter, I hesitated. Shaking off my fear, I told myself I was overreacting. It was broad daylight, and I'd stick close to home. About 15 minutes into my run, my sense of unease grew. There was a figure following me at a distance. It was him. He wasn't running, just just briskly walking, keeping pace. Panic set in, and I sprinted home, locking the doors behind me. I told my parents, and my father decided to report it to our local police station. However, without any concrete evidence or threatening behavior, there was little they could do. The next few days were quiet. No sign of the man. I started to think that maybe I had overreacted, or perhaps he had moved on to another town. It wasn't until late one night, while I was reading in my room, that I felt the sense of being watched again. Glancing out of my window, I saw him. He was standing across the street, under the faint glow of a street lamp, staring directly at my window. Our eyes locked, and his chilling smile returned. The next morning, we found a note slipped under our front door. Scribbled in rough handwriting, they read, "I like watching you. I think you like it too." I was horrified. We reported it to the police, and this time they took it more seriously. They began patrolling our street at night and advised us to keep our doors and windows locked. But even with the police presence, the man persisted. Every other night, he'd be somewhere nearby, always watching, always out of reach. We installed security cameras, but he was adept at avoiding them. Then, one evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise from the downstairs living room. Slowly, I descended the staircase, and what I saw froze me in place. The man was inside our house, standing in the dimly lit room, that same cold smile plastered on his face. I screamed, alerting my parents. My father rushed down, wielding a baseball bat, but by the time we reached the living room, he was gone, the front door left slightly ajar. The police were at our home within minutes. A thorough search of our property and surrounding areas yielded nothing. But this break, it was the turning point. The town rallied around us, setting up a neighborhood watch and sharing any information they might have about the stranger. With a united front and increased police vigilance, we hoped he would be caught soon. Weeks passed without incident. The summer was drawing to a close, and the tourist rush was dwindling. With no sign of the man, we started to believe the nightmare was over. However, one evening, as we were having dinner, a news bulletin flashed on the TV. A man had been arrested at a nearby town for breaking and entering, and the police suspected he might be linked to multiple stalking cases. The mugshot displayed was all too familiar. It turned out the man had a history of fixating on women in various towns, stalking them for a while, and then moving on to a new location, a new victim. Our small town was just his latest stop. For a while after the man's arrest, life in our quaint coastal town slowly began to regain its charm. Tourist season ended, and the warm hues of summer transitioned into the crisp golden palette of fall. The streets grew quiet, the beaches empty, and life became that gentle lull that we were so used to. However, the memory of that summer cast a long shadow. As much as I tried to push the events to the back of my mind, they lingered. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected knock on the door would send my heart racing. Nightmares became a frequent visitor, with visions of that man's haunting smile appearing as I slept. My parents, noticing the change in my demeanor, suggested counseling. I was initially resistant. The idea of foretelling the events, reliving the fear, seemed counterproductive. However, the more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed to confront my fears to move past them. I started seeing Dr. Shaw, a local therapist renowned for her work with trauma victims. The first few sessions were tough. Tears flowed freely as I recounted the events, but Dr. Shaw was patient, guiding me through the process, helping me identify triggers, and teaching me coping mechanisms. In the midst of my therapy sessions, I found an unexpected source of solace, my community. Word had spread about what I was going through, and the outpouring of support was overwhelming. Neighbors would drop by with baked goods, friends organized weekend get-togethers, and I even joined a local support group for people who had experienced trauma. Sharing my story with others and hearing theirs made me realize I wasn't alone in my struggle. One evening, as I was returning from a support group meeting, I received a message from Sophia, an old school friend. She had moved out of town for college and we had lost touch, but she had heard about my ordeal through mutual friends. The message read, "Hey, I heard about what happened last summer. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. It reminded me of something similar that happened here in Boston. Maybe we can catch up. I think talking about it might help both of us." I hesitated, but eventually I agreed. We decided to meet up during the upcoming winter break. Reconnecting with Sophia was like a breath of fresh air. Over coffee, she shared her experience, which had eerie parallels to mine. We bonded over our shared trauma, finding strength in each other's stories. As winter turned to spring and then summer, life continued. With the help of therapy, community support, and friends like Sophia, the wounds began to heal. The nightmares grew less frequent, and the town's charm started to shine brightly once again. Looking back, that harrowing summer taught me a lot about resilience, community, and the human spirit. While I would never wish such an experience on anyone, it shaped me into a stronger, more empathetic individual. It was a testament to the fact that even in the darkest moments, with the right support, one can find their way back to the light. I always considered myself lucky to live in a small, tight-knit community. Beacon Ridge was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged homemade casseroles, kids played on the streets until dusk, and the annual community fair was the biggest event of the year. My family moved there when I was 5, so by the time I headed off to college, I knew every nook and cranny of the town and almost everyone in it. When I returned home after graduating, I took up a job as a reporter for our local newspaper. Beacon Ridge was always peaceful, so the police blotter was mostly filled with minor disturbances. That was until one autumn day when a series of break-ins shattered our community's sense of safety. It started with Mrs. Thompson, who lived 3 doors down from us. She came home from her weekly book club to find her back door ajar and her living room in disarray. Nothing was stolen, but an uneaten sandwich sat on her kitchen counter, a bite taken out of it. The next incident was at the Mitchells, where again, nothing was stolen, but a family photo from their living room now had faces eerily scratched out. The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors became wary, installing security cameras and reinforcing locks. The police wrapped up their patrols, and community meetings were held to discuss safety measures. I wrote about the incidents for the newspaper, and as I dug deeper, I found a pattern. All the affected houses were ones where the residents had recently returned from out-of-town trips. Someone was watching, keeping track of the comings and goings. I decided to talk to the local motel owners. Maybe the intruder was a guest. My hunch proved right when Mr. Garfield, who ran the Beacon Inn, recalled a guest named Martin who had been staying for a few weeks and often made inquiries about residents. Working with the police, we discovered that Martin was using a false name. His real name was Carl, and he was diagnosed with a mental disorder, having escaped from a facility 2 towns over. But while the police knew who he was, Carl was elusive. Days turned into weeks with no further incidents, making everyone believe he had moved on. That belief was shattered one evening. I had just come home from work, exhausted. My parents were out of town, so I had the house to myself. After dinner, I curled up on the sofa to watch some TV. Hours later, I woke up, the TV screen filled with static. I groggily checked the time, 2:13 a.m. As I was about to head to bed, I heard a faint noise upstairs. Thinking it might be the cat, I brushed it off, but then the floorboards creaked, unmistakably under the weight of human footsteps. Panic gripped me. Someone was in the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator about the intruder. She urged me to find a safe place to hide and stay on the line. Moving as quietly as I could, I slipped into the pantry, pushing shelves in front of the door. I then crawled into a corner, phone clutched to my ear. I heard footsteps descend the stairs, slowly, deliberately. They moved into the living room, pausing for agonizing minutes, and then they began to approach the kitchen. The door handle rattled. The intruder tried pushing the door, but the shelves held. A soft, eerie humming began from the other side, making my skin crawl. Time seemed to stretch infinitely, but soon, the wail of sirens cut through the night. The footsteps retreated hastily, followed by the slamming of the back door. Police found Carl hiding in our backyard shed. He was taken into custody without incident and later sent to a secure facility. The aftermath of the ordeal was both relieving and unsettling. The town, previously untouched by such events, was now buzzing with anxiety and curiosity. People would often stop me in the local grocery store or coffee shop, wanting to know more details or just check if I was alright. Sophia, my best friend since childhood, was especially shaken by the event. She lived only a few houses down, and the thought that she might have been next haunted her. She invited me over for dinner the next week. For some girl time and to check in, she had said. We sat on her porch, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot cocoa as we often did during our countless heart-to-heart sessions growing up. The warm liquid was comforting, as were Sophia's familiar stories and laughter. However, as the night grew darker, we couldn't help but revisit the subject of Carl. Did you ever see him around town before? Sophia asked, her fingers nervously playing with the handle of her mug. I thought back, trying to recall if I had ever crossed paths with the man. No, not that I could remember, I replied. But then again, he was good at blending in. Sophia nodded, deep in thought. It's just so strange. I mean, why Beacon Ridge? Why us? We may never know, I responded, thinking of all the research I had done for my articles. Carl's past was enigmatic, and aside from his recent escape, not much was known about him. As the weeks passed, the terror of that night began to fade, replaced by the mundanities of daily life. Sophia and I took self-defense classes together, and there was a noticeable increase in security system installations in Beacon Ridge. Community meetings were more frequent, and neighbors made a concerted effort to check in on each other. In a way, Carl's intrusion had inadvertently strengthened the bond of the community. The annual Beacon Ridge Fair that year had the highest turnout in its history. story. Residents young and old came together, not only to enjoy the festivities, but to stand united against the fear that had briefly gripped them. Months later, I received a letter at the newspaper office. There was no return address, only a hastily scrawled message. "You were lucky." Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. I immediately contacted the police, who confirmed that Carl was still securely detained. They suspected it was a prank or an attempt to rattle the community once more. But even with that reassurance, the shadow of that night lingered. I often found myself double-checking my logs or glancing over my shoulder on my evening walks. Beacon Ridge had lost a bit of its innocence, but in its place grew a resilience and unity that made me prouder than ever to call it home. Sophia and I often talked about that turbulent time, reminding ourselves of the importance of community and friendship. The events had shown us that even in the darkest moments, the combined strength of a close-knit community could shine the brightest. However, as years went by, the ordeal became a distant memory, a story to be told to newcomers and younger generations. But for those of us who lived through it, it served as a constant reminder of the fragility of safety and the importance of unity. Beacon Ridge wasn't just a town, it was a family, and families stick together no matter what. I've lived in my apartment for about 3 years now. It's one of those modern complexes with security features and supposedly safe surroundings. You swipe a card to get into the building, there's a concierge desk, and we even have a tiny gym. It's not luxurious, but it's been my haven, my little piece of sanctuary. Until last winter, every morning, like clockwork, I'd leave for work at 7:45 a.m. I'd take the elevator down from the 9th floor to the lobby, say hi to Derek at the concierge desk, and step out into the brisk morning air. This routine had never been disrupted. Until one morning in December, it began subtly. I started finding small, innocent enough notes in my mailbox. The first one read, "I like your blue coat." That's it. No name, no other message. I shrugged it off, assuming it was a misplaced note meant for someone else or perhaps a prank from a neighbor. Then, the notes grew more frequent and specific. "Your hair looked nice today. You seemed tired this morning. Rough night. New perfume. It smells sweet." My comfort started to waver. The handwriting was always the same, a hurried scrawl, as if the person didn't want to spend much time writing it. I thought about mentioning it to Derek or maybe even the police, but what would I say? That someone's leaving me unsettling compliments. One evening, when returning from a night out with friends, I noticed something off. My front door was slightly ajar. Panic surged. I pushed the door open with the tip of my boot, my heart in my throat. My apartment was a mess. Drawers were pulled out, their contents spilled, my couch cushions were on the floor, and my refrigerator was left open. But nothing was missing, not my TV, not my laptop, not even the cash I had on my counter. However, on my dining table, perfectly placed in the center, was another note. "Your bed is soft." The audacity of this person to not only break into my home, but to take a moment to lie on my bed was both infuriating and terrifying. I called the police immediately. They arrived promptly, took a statement, and examined the apartment. Without evidence of who might have done this, they advised me to install cameras and be vigilant. The next day, I bought a security camera and placed it facing my front door. Feeling slightly reassured, I tried to continue with life, but every rustle in the hallway, every unexpected sound made me jumpy. I spoke to Derek about it, and he promised to be more alert. A week later, I came home to find another note, this time on the inside of my door. "Cameras will help you." I felt my stomach drop. I rushed to my computer, pulled up the footage, and there he was. A tall man, face obscured by a hoodie, slipping into my apartment, and then back out just a few minutes later. I handed the footage to the police, but without a clear face shot, they couldn't do much. They upped the patrols in the area, and I notified my building's management. They sent a memo to all residents to be on the lookout and ensure all security measures were being followed. That night, as I tried to sleep, every sound was amplified. I'd jump at the slightest noise, convinced he was back. Days turned into restless nights. My eyes grew heavy with dark circles, and my coworkers whispered worriedly. One morning, as I sipped coffee, there was a soft knock on my door. It was Derek, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. "Can we chat?" he asked. We sat down, and he hesitated a moment before speaking. "Look, I didn't want to say anything before because I thought I might be overreacting, but there's a guy. He's not from our building. Every morning, just before you leave, he stands across the street, just watching. He's always in a black hoodie." Chills ran down my spine. Why didn't you mention this earlier? I cried. I only connected the dots after hearing about the break-in. "I'm so sorry." Together, we approached the police with this new piece of information. They decided to set up a sting operation. An undercover officer would pose as me, complete with my blue coat, and see if the man would approach. The operation was set for a Thursday. As the decoy left the the building, sure enough, the man in the hoodie started to follow. Within minutes, officers apprehended him. It turned out he was a wanted stalker in 3 states, having terrorized multiple women over the years. My simple routine, my uneventful walk out of my building each morning, had somehow caught his eye. Our conversations over coffee usually revolved around life, security measures, and sometimes we'd share a laugh or two about non-related topics. But every once in a while, the topic would revert to that chilling winter episode. One such day, I remarked, "You know, Derek, that whole incident made me realize how invisible we sometimes feel in a city. Here we are, surrounded by people, yet someone can watch you, stalk you, and nobody would even realize." He nodded in agreement, taking a sip from his cup. It's a double-edged sword, really. The anonymity of a city can be comforting, but sometimes it can also be a cloak for those with darker intentions. There was a brief pause, the weight of our experiences hanging in the air. But then Derek, always the one to find a lighter note, chuckled, "You know, the new complex I'm working at is state-of-the-art security. Biometrics, face recognition, the whole 9 yards. I feel like I'm working in a spy movie." I laughed. "Well, James Bond, let's hope you never have to deal with a hoodie guy sequel." He raised his cup in a mock toast to safer days and technology outsmarting the creeps. Months passed, and life found a new rhythm. I immersed myself in work, picked up new hobbies, and even started attending group therapy for survivors of stalking and similar traumas. It was there I met Ava, a vibrant woman with a heart-wrenching story of her own. We clicked instantly and became pillars of support for each other. One evening, Ava and I sat on my balcony, the golden hues of the sunset painting the sky. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting a mix of pain and hope. "You know, these incidents, as terrifying as they are, they change you, but not always for the worse. They make you stronger, more resilient." I nodded, holding back tears. "They teach you to value peace, safety, and the genuine people around you." We sat there in silence, finding solace in each other's company, cherishing the newfound security in our lives. The city buzzed beneath us, alive and pulsating, a reminder of both the shadows and the lights that coexisted within it. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the memories began to fade. Not entirely, but enough to let the healing process truly take over. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to face adversity and come out stronger on the other side. While I could never forget those dark winter days, the spring that followed was a symbol of renewal and hope. Life had thrown its worst at me, but with the support of friends like Derek and Ava, I had weathered the storm. And as the saying goes, after the darkest night, there's a bright day ahead. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.